What if a hidden book held secrets of time itself? Imagine a scroll tucked away in the silence of history, carrying stories that never reached most of our ears. For centuries, people searched the heavens, searched their own hearts, asking, is there something more, something lost, something that could have given us the guidance we crave today? We live in a world full of voices, some loud, some fleeting, some confusing. Yet deep down, the human heart has always carried one longing: to return to the source of truth, to the place where silence speaks louder than noise. Every generation has asked questions about where we came from, what destiny holds, and how time itself was meant to be understood. The Book of Jubilees is one of those forgotten whispers, not as well known as Genesis or Exodus, yet it stands in the shadows like a gentle echo of Mount Sinai. Ancient scribes called it the Little Genesis, for it retells the beginning of the world with details often left unspoken in the common scriptures. It speaks of angels walking with men, of laws written in the sky before they were carved in stone, and of a timeline divided with heavenly precision. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the desert. The night stretches endlessly. Sand cools beneath the stars, and the winds hush as if not to disturb the quiet of eternity. Somewhere in that stillness, a figure waits on the mountain, wrapped in solitude. The mountain glows faintly with unseen fire, while above, the heavens arch like a vast book of their own. And within this silence, stories are whispered, stories that would one day be known as the Book of Jubilees. It is said that on Sinai, not only was the law given, but hidden words were spoken. Words carried not just for one people, but as a reminder of the order of time itself. Jubilees takes us by the hand and shows us a world where time is not random but carefully measured, where every year, every cycle, every jubilee carries meaning. To the ancients, this book was not just a text, it was a rhythm, a sacred calendar that kept heaven and earth in harmony. But history, like sand carried by the wind, often buries what once shined. For many, Jubilees slipped from memory. Libraries of the West left it behind. But far in the highlands of Ethiopia, the book was preserved in their sacred Bible. To them, it was never lost. To them, the whisper of Sinai still carried weight. As we step into this story together, think of how it feels to find a letter from an ancestor, words written for you long ago, yet never read until now. That is how the Book of Jubilees speaks. It reminds us that the world was always more layered than we imagined, that angels and men, heaven and earth, law and story, all were woven together in ways we can still trace. The pages of Jubilees do not rush. They unfold like the slow turning of seasons. They invite you to rest, to listen, to let the ancient silence speak again. And as you hear them, you may sense that you are not just learning history, you are stepping into a forgotten rhythm of time itself. Before we journey deeper into these hidden chapters, let me pause here with a little request. If you're listening right now, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. It's one small way to stay connected as we wander through these sacred and forgotten stories together. And I'd love for you to share something with me in the comments. Tell me your name, your city, and what time of day you're watching this. It makes this experience feel less like a distant story and more like a gathering of friends across the world. And if your heart longs to hold the full collection of ancient texts, you'll find the link in the description. The complete Bible of 88 books as preserved in Ethiopia and the Book of Enoch in English. They are Treyas, Urus waiting to be held, waiting to be read. The desert night lingers. The stars above are still watching. And the whisper of Sinai continues, calling us forward into the next pages of the Book of Jubilees. The mountain was encased in clouds and shrouded in a living, breathing silence. The ground itself appeared to breathe under the weight of something eternal, and the air shook with an invisible presence. Moses was by himself at Sinai, But he was not alone, because what was happening to him was not your typical encounter between God and humanity. The boundaries between heaven and earth vanished in the faint glow of fire that did not consume the summit. Eternity unfolded like a book that was ready to be read, and time, as men knew it, stopped. A voice emerged in that silence, clear but not thunderous, neither wholly divine nor wholly human. It was an angel's voice, selected to deliver the prepared words long before Moses ever set foot on the sands of the desert. This messenger was more than just a herald. He was a record keeper who had witnessed the dawn of time. He spoke with the subdued authority of someone who possessed memories too big for human brains to contain, memories that were preserved on indestructible parchment, but on eternally bright heavenly tablets. This was more than just revelation to Moses. It was being drawn into a narrative that predated the formation of nations, the ascent of monarchs, and even the evolution of the first human being. What he heard was not merely history, but a retelling, one that was meticulously woven, characterized by heavenly rhythm, and that developed not as men narrate events, but rather as heaven itself recalled them. The Book of Jubilees is unique because of this. Instead of speaking like a man, it speaks like the angel who drew Moses into a tapestry of time that was sanctified, ordered, and measured on Sinai. The angel described creation to Moses in distinct divisions, in years and cycles that rolled like the seasons rather than in hazy echoes. Every second was planned, every line delineated. The world's story was inscribed in eternity rather than being abandoned. As Moses listened, his heart shook with wonder rather than fear, because he understood that he was receiving not just the law for his people, but also the very course of time. Humanity had been blind, counting days and gauging years by the moon's waxing. But here was a sacred calendar that God had traced, a rhythm older than the stars. The angel's voice flowed like a river, soft but firm. In addition to being historical figures, he described Adam and Eve as being a part of a divine chronology, with each event being rooted in cycles and jubilees. He disclosed how angels themselves had meticulously annotated the history of humanity on tablets hidden from mortal view, and how heaven had always been keeping watch. This was history etched in light, not in dust. With each word, the cloud-covered mountains seemed to breathe. As if creation itself were leaning in to hear its own tale repeated, the desert below lay quiet. These weren't merely historical documents to Moses. These discoveries were intended to direct the present and influence the future. He realized that the angel's gift was more than just recollection. It was guidance, and a heavenly reminder that the history of humanity was holy, well-organized, and meaningful. As though to remind Moses that human forgetfulness was a constant threat, the angel spoke gently but firmly. Without the beat of heaven, men would become lost in chaos as generations came and went. This book and this retelling were given to God's people not to pique their curiosity, but to serve as a reminder that despite their wanderings and exile, they were part of a larger order than was visible to them. Moses could practically feel the weight of the table. It says the voice unfolded, not of stone this time, but of something indestructible. The words were carried in a language that did not require ink, and they were etched deeper than mountain rock. They served as a reminder of the enduring connection that existed between heaven and earth, as well as between God and His creation, and that was maintained over countless cycles of time. The angel's presence was steady rather than overpowering, like a friend strolling alongside Moses in the stillness. There was only the serene rhythm of the truth being revealed. No hurry, no urgency. As if transporting the sound of this divine recounting over invisible distances, the desert winds moved gently around the mountain. In that secret moment, the sacred trust was shared, and the very air felt heavy with memory. Later readers of this book might perceive it as just another tale, another level of tradition. But Moses knew it was much more in the silence of Sinai. Men did not create these. They were the exact account of a messenger who existed outside of time, whose eyes had witnessed the creation process, and who carried the eternal music in his voice. Every word served as a reminder to Moses that history was meticulously planned rather than chaotic. Nothing had been left up to chance. Moses listened as someone who understands that every word has significance while standing with his heart open. He realized that the angel's whispers were intended for future generations as well as for him. They would be inherited, maybe forgotten by some, maybe hidden for a while, but always there to be found again. And the truth contained in these retellings would endure forever, even if the world came to doubt them. The cloud on the mountain grew thicker, enclosing Moses in isolation, but he was unfrightened. Rather, he found solace in the knowledge that the voice at his side was helping him navigate the enigma of time. Every hardship his people would experience and every journey they would take had already been woven into a greater scheme, as if heaven itself were leaning in to reassure him. As steadily as the night in the desert, the angel's words kept coming. Standing between heaven and earth, Moses was given not only the law, but also the memory of creation itself, the Jubilee rhythm, and the order that would serve as a reminder to humanity of their place in an incalculably vast story. And the story hung in the air, alive and unbroken, waiting to bring its light into the hearts of those who would hear it again, while the winds whispered softly against the stone of Sinai. Each star blazed with a constant light that appeared to pulse in time with a higher order, and the stars stretched across the sky like a silver river. Time did not float aimlessly in the stillness of the heavens. Rather, it flowed like a melody written long before humans discovered how to quantify it. This was the rhythm the angel was referring to. It was woven by the Creator himself, not by human hands. Time is presented in the Book of Jubilees as a precisely calculated 364-day solar calendar that reflects the perfection of divine design, rather than as a jumble of days and nights. It was not the calendar that men used. For generations, people had gazed at the moon, following its pale cycles across the sky as it waxed and waned. However, the lunar rhythm was erratic, changing with every step and becoming discordant with the everlasting order. Moses was reminded by the angel that sacred time should not be constrained by shadows and changes, but rather by light, which is as unwavering and constant as the sun. Every year was consistent, every season flowed in unison, and the Lord's festivals could be observed without misunderstanding under this solar calendar. Moses listened in silent wonder, since he was aware of how easily people can become disoriented when time is not managed correctly. Seasons became unpredictable, festivals drifted, and the people lost the rhythm that connected them to their Creator. However, as if revealing a celestial clock to his eyes, the angel revealed the actual pattern here on the mountain. Weeks of 7 preceded the holy Jubilees that crowned each cycle of days. Every festival brought Israel into harmony with the music of heaven, and every season served as a reminder of their covenant. Sabbaths, the weekly rhythm that reflected creation itself, were mentioned by the angel. This was not just an order, it was a reflection of eternity, 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. The people would join in the rest of heaven by keeping the Sabbath, in addition to remembering what God had done. Months followed these weeks, and then seasons, until the year's full circle was completed. The holidays of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot all returned to their proper locations, shining like unwavering lights throughout the year rather than straying with the moon. Think of the heavens as a huge clock that rotates in time with the motion of the stars, rather than the sound of gears. Every season was a new note in the cosmic hymn, and every sunrise was a hand moving across the dial. The angel explained it as though Moses were being shown the inner workings of the cosmos. The 364-day year was not arbitrary. Rather, it was the exact ratio of 7-day weeks multiplied by 52 weeks. Neither more nor less. The order was perfect, unbroken, and eternal. Every Sabbath was certain, every festival returned on the same day, and no generation would fall out of the divine rhythm under such a calendar. This was not a casual vision of time. The angel forewarned that one day men would turn back to the moon and abandon the solar order, either because of their own desires or because of the influence of the nations around them. Their festivals would drift as a result, becoming out of sync with heaven. Sacred days would be lost, confusion would grow, and what should have anchored them would instead leave them adrift. As if the angel had already witnessed men's wandering hearts, preferring shadows to the sun's constant light, the words were laced with a subdued sadness. However, Moses was given the complete truth at this precise moment. He realized that the festivals were living appointments with the divine, as well as commemorations of historical occurrences. Yes, Passover symbolized the liberation from Egypt, but it also alluded to the everlasting pattern of deliverance. Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, commemorated both the continual covenant between God and his people, as well as the giving of the law. Sukkot, the Festival of Booths, served as a reminder that God's presence was their home, even in impermanence, and was not just about wandering in the wilderness. Every festival served as a portal into a more profound reality. The angel's voice flowed as if the heavens were turning. He compared the year to a wheel, with the weeks as its spokes, the Jubilees as its rim, and the covenant as its hub. Moses experienced the beauty of it as he listened, the way that sacred time held both promise and memory. It was more than just the hours going by. It was the telling of a story, God's story, which Israel was repeatedly being invited to join. The sky itself was painted with vivid imagery. The sun could be thought of as the sanctuary's great lamp, rising and setting precisely. Each star maintained its position and marked the passage of the days, moving like jewels embedded in the night's fabric. In this vision, time was neither an inexorable march toward decay, nor an enemy to be feared. The faithful were always led back to the heart of their Creator by this sacred rhythm. Moses felt the weight of this gift as he stood there in the silence of Sinai. He recognized that in addition to laws to govern their daily lives, the populace would also require a routine, a rhythm that would serve as a reminder of their identity. They would drift without it. No matter how far they wandered, they would always be anchored with it. The 364-day year was more than just a calendar. It was a covenant in and of itself, a means of keeping pace with eternity. Moses thus started to feel that time itself was holy ground as the angel spoke. The days and weeks were holy when they were characterized by the divine order, just as the mountain beneath his feet was holy due to the presence that dwelt upon it. Every festival, Sabbath, and sunrise turned into a space where heaven and earth met. In doing so, the populace would not only remember, but also live in harmony with the creation's very pulse. The echo of this lesson traveled across invisible valleys as the desert winds rustled against the stones. The knowledge that time was not empty, but rather alive, sanctified and ordered, waiting to guide his people into communion with the Eternal One, dawned on Moses somewhere deep within him. And far above, the stars glistened, unwavering and steady, as if confirming the pattern that had been spoken from the start. There was initially nothing but silence, as though the cosmos itself was holding its breath, anticipating the first word. Then, at the Eternal One's command, creation unfolded like light piercing the endless night. Light, water, land, sky, and the delicate seed of life emerged from the silence before the voice that summoned everything into existence was quiet and confident rather than thunderous. Carefully placed, the stars bloomed like jewels across the heavens. Where there had been nothing but emptiness, the rivers carried songs of movement as they meandered through valleys. Every sunrise and every breeze painted a new picture of beauty on the soft, waiting canvas that was the earth. One day after another, the days came slowly, each with its own wonder. A steady dance of morning and evening was given to light and darkness. While the dry land stretched out to meet the sun, the waters split into seas and flowed indefinitely. The earth was painted in previously unseen hues as trees grew tall, their branches laden with fruit, and flowers opened in silent adoration. Fish darted through rivers and seas that glistened beneath the heavens, and birds soared, their wings catching the world's first winds. It seemed as though the world itself was celebrating its birth as a gentle chorus of harmony rose from all corners of creation. Then, man began to take shape. The Creator created a body out of earthly dust that was both strong and delicate, lifeless until breath was given. Eyes opened for the first time as the breath of life entered, revealing a clean and new world. In the midst of the wonders of creation, Adam, the first human, stood with the naivete of a child. The scent of rivers and flowers filled his lungs as he took his first breath in wonder. His soul radiated the light of the one who created him, and his heartbeat was steady, like the rhythm of the earth itself. As they strolled through the garden, the Creator guided him to the trees, streams, and living things that now inhabited the land. With each step came new wonders. Gentle deer sipping at crystal-clear waters, lions stretching in the sun, and doves fluttering among the branches. Adam gave them names, each one erupting gently from his mouth like a song of animal and human recognition. Nevertheless, a silent desire arose inside of him despite this abundance. Despite being surrounded by life, he was unique and had no voice to match his own. He was thus granted rest by the Creator, a sound sleep as gentle as the silence of the evening as it descended on the world. From that rest came Eve, who was created from Adam's own side rather than the dust. She was a gift from Adam. Loneliness vanished when his eyes opened and he saw her. When their eyes locked, a bond that words could not describe was formed, recognition. Together, they were complete, and she was a mirror of his heart. Their laughter rose like a melody woven into the rustling leaves as they strolled hand in hand beneath the branches of Eden. There has never been a place like the garden itself. The land was continuously irrigated by rivers that flowed in 4 different directions. Every season, trees produced fruit that was sweet and brilliant in color. The green carpeted floor felt soft under bare feet, and the air was consistently warm, not too hot or cold, just right for tranquility. At night, the stars glowed brighter and closer, as if heaven were leaning in to embrace them, while light danced through the branches, scattering gold patterns on the ground. There was only the peaceful joy of life and the proximity of their Creator. There was no fear or weight of grief. Every moment was filled with wonder for Adam and Eve. They became familiar with the sounds of birds, the fragrances of flowers, and the refreshing feel of rivers. Taking care of the garden was like taking care of a gift. Work was not labor, but joy. As the sky changed from morning to evening, they lay beneath the trees, listened to the bees humming, and gratefully picked fruit. They lived in harmony with the world, not as a place to conquer. Creation seemed to rejoice in their presence, and their hearts beat in time with it. A tree unlike any other, the tree of life, stood tall with branches that reached the sky in the center of the garden. It represented eternity and the assurance that, in the presence of the Eternal One, life was permanent rather than transient. As a reminder of the gift they had received, life that was complete, undamaged, and shadowless, its fruit glowed gently, unaltered, and waiting. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, however, grew close by and served as a mystery as well as a boundary. The words of the Creator hovered over it, a tender directive that protected their naivete. They were allowed to wander around and enjoy the abundance of the garden, but they were not allowed to touch this tree. Nevertheless, there was no shadow in their hearts during those initial days. Their innocence served as a more ideal covering than any clothing as they moved freely while wearing only light clothing. They were only happy when the sun warmed them. They were not afraid when night fell because the Creator's voice was close by, accompanying them on their walk in the cool of the day. Every breath, every step, and every look at their surroundings was infused with a camaraderie that was unlike any other. The gentle sounds of Eden in those days are almost audible. The distant call of birds, the laughter of flowing waters, and the rustle of leaves stirred by gentle breezes. The scent of earth's purest sweetness, rather than man-made perfumes, permeated the air. Every sunrise was a promise reaffirmed, every heartbeat was a hymn, and the world was free from sorrow. Their world was familiar to Adam and Eve. They were a part of it, a part of its very fabric, cherished and protected. Their lives resembled a peaceful beginning, a dream of innocence. Every night closed in rest under the watchful eye of heaven, and every day opened like a gift. There was no trace of fear, no memory of pain, and no weight of the future in those early moments of life. The only thing in front of them was the rich, limitless present, which flowed like an unending river. They discovered their happiness in the here and now, not in material belongings or authority, but rather in the pure wonder of being alive, of being with one another, and of walking alongside the one who breathed for them. The garden was a place of unending beauty, where time seemed to stop, and the sun's rise was a gentle unfolding of light over a world still enveloped in perfection rather than a command to work. The grass glistened with the morning's touch, and dew adhered to each leaf like crystal drops. With branches laden with fruit of hues that see, emmed beyond the range of the human eye, each tree raised its arms toward the sky. As the rivers wound through Eden like silver ribbons of life, their currents sang, and they were transparent mirrors of the sky. It was more than just a garden. It was a living hymn, with each animal, wind, and star above all blended together to whisper of the Creator's presence. With unhurried steps and unburdened hearts, Adam and Eve strolled hand in hand. Only the innocence of beings untarnished by brokenness was present, along with no knowledge of grief or shadow of shame. Their unguarded, light laughter reverberated against the trees as if the air itself were celebrating. The animals approached Adam as he spoke, cocking their heads as though they could sense the soft rhythm of his voice. The tree appeared to bow beneath Eve's touch as she reached for fruit, joyfully offering itself. They were the guardians of this paradise, not its rulers, and they shared the same breath that had given them life. Eden's beauty lay in both the tangible and intangible. Deep within the soul, there was a calm that was incomprehensible. The scent of flowers, clean water, and the soft ground beneath bare feet seemed to permeate the air, which itself seemed to be alive with warmth and fragrance. Deeper, softer, and glowing with a purity untarnished by time, colors were not as we know them today. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves was like the gentle strumming of harps, a kind of music that was incorporated into the very fabric of nature. A presence moved among them in the cool evening when the sky was painted in rose and gold hues and the shadows were long. Like a father guiding his children, it was the Creator's closeness, not loud or overwhelming, but gentle and recognizable. In his presence, Adam and Eve experienced comfort rather than fear. To them, his movements in the garden were as steady as the flow of the river and as organic as the morning chorus of birds. When he barred him, their hearts soared because they felt complete in his presence, as though that tender communion held the entire world together. The angels watched in silent awe from far above, out of human sight. They had witnessed the formation of land, the separation of waters, and the birth of light. But this was something else. Humanity was not like the endlessly burning stars or the untamed animals that prowled the planet. The one who had spoken everything into existence was reflected in Adam and Eve. Their innocence, their laughter, and their unwavering unity astounded the angels. There was no danger to defend against, so some hovered at the edges of Eden, guardians brandishing gleaming but unsheathed swords of fire. The mystery of this creation that walked upright, breathed freely, and carried eternity in fragile form moved the hearts of others who merely watched in silence. The angels would occasionally stoop low, their bodies concealed like a beam of light through the trees, and listen to Adam and Eve converse. Their gentle voices and straightforward words sounded like songs that could be heard even in the halls of heaven. This quiet love, this innocence that had not yet learned sorrow, moved the angels who had experienced unfathomable glory and power. As they sat under the stars and named the constellations together, they observed Adam cupping water in his hands for Eve to drink, and Eve weaving flowers into his hair. The holiness of these insignificant deeds was as bright as any hymn sung in front of the throne. The promise of paradise was just as beautiful as what it provided. There was no drive, no aspiration, and no desire for more. Every desire was satisfied with love, and every need was met in plenty. The hawk flew unafraid of the sparrow, and the lion rested contentedly close to the lamb. The law of Eden was balance, and the breath that filled its air was harmony. There, every moment was brimming with happiness as ripe as fruit weighing down the branch. To live there was to live in fullness. Humanity was whole and complete, the exact reflection of the Creator's intent, and had not yet been split apart. Adam and Eve would lie on the grass and look up at the stars at night, when they were revealed in innumerable numbers. They thought they could touch the heavens because they were so close. Each constellation was a lamp burning in the sky of eternity, and they all glowed brighter and more alive. Even though Adam and Eve couldn't see the angels above, their light blended with the stars as they joined in the cosmic dance, and they felt a sense of warmth and the knowledge that they were never alone. The garden itself was a haven of vigilance, protected by the Creator's word rather than walls. They were clothed in innocence, unadulterated and unbroken. Since nothing was hidden or broken within them, they were unaware of shame. Their minds were as clear as the flow of a river, and their hearts were as open as the sky. They had no concept of sin, no recollection of suffering, and no expectation of dying. The rhythm of sunrise and sunset, laughter and relaxation, and the sun and moon were used to measure time instead of decay. Their existence was a song rather than a burden, and each breath they took was a part of the creation chorus. In their silent awe, the angels pondered the brittleness of everything. They were aware of the dangers of freedom and the weight of choice. However, Eden was unaltered, complete, and a dream that was alive in the Eternal's heart at that precise moment. They guarded, watched, and sang softly in unseen places, their voices blending with the wind that blew through the trees. Even the stars appeared to sag closer as Adam and Eve strolled through the garden barefoot, their happiness resonating beneath the sky, as though the entire universe held its breath in wonder at the beauty of innocence alive on earth. Even though Eden's gates were now closed and guarded, the sweetness of its memory was still present in the early world's air. Even though they were outside of that ideal garden, Adam and Eve could still feel the beat of creation all around them. They cultivated the land that now resisted them, raising their children in the silent hope that one day innocence would return. Their days were full of labor and love. They had 2 sons, Qabil and Habil, who grew up together but had quite different hearts. Their tale would go down in history as one of the greatest tragedies, the first rift not only of innocence but of fraternity itself. The elder, Qabil, was a man of the land. With perspiration on his brow, he turned the earth, sowed seeds, and drew life from the dust. The ground produced fruit under his hands, and his labor was his strength. The flocks were cared for by the younger Habil. His life flowed in time with his animals bleating, their footsteps, and their morning breaths. He patiently kept watch over them, leading them to clear streams and verdant pastures. Both brothers had the characteristics of their parents, but they also had distinct personalities and desires. The moment had arrived for both to present their greatest desires to the Creator. It was an outpouring of the heart, an act of devotion as much as duty. Qabil plucked from the ground what his hands had worked to produce, crops and fruits, arranged with effort but without the spirit of surrender. Habil laid the best, blemish-free firstborn from his flock on the altar in silent adoration. Both offerings produced smoke, but Habil's scent was the one that delighted the heavens since it was offered in all its chastity, trust, and devotion. Qabil was deeply affected by the moment of distinction. What should have been an act of worship instead sowed a seed of resentment in his heart. Although his offering was the result of labor, it lacked the spirit of surrender. A shadow entered him when he saw his brother's sacrifice accepted while his own was rejected. At first, jealousy crept in subtly, feeding off the difference. He no longer viewed his brother as a lifelong friend, but rather as a competitor. His mind was hazy with bitterness, and his heart ached from unsaid words. Gentle and modest, Habil did not raise his voice or hand in opposition to his brother. In a quiet voice, he exhorted Qabil to master the darkness that was growing inside of him and turn his heart toward the Creator. However, the murmur of jealousy was more persistent and louder. It twisted Qabil's vision as it pressed against his chest, leaving him with only the sting of rejection. Even the sun above seemed to glare at him with judgment as the fields he once loved became heavy underfoot. Subsequently, Qabil summoned his brother into the open field. The air was still and the morning was quiet, as if creation itself was waiting. Habil trailed behind, oblivious to his brother's inner turmoil. They may have exchanged words, pleaded, or remained silent as stone. Then Qabil struck, his hands shaking with rage. The first human blood was drank by the earth that had once welcomed the footsteps of both brothers. The innocence of brotherhood was shattered along with Habil's voice going silent. The angels watched in sorrow, because, after watching humanity with hope, they now witnessed the world's first violent act. Like an unstoppable voice, the cry of Habil's blood arose from the earth. It was more than just the death of a single person. It was the start of a wound that would last for generations and serve as a reminder that jealousy can turn into destructive behavior once it takes root. This occasion has significance in the Book of Jubilees that extends beyond the actual deed. It describes how Qabil violated the holy order that had been established from the start, in addition to spilling his brother's blood. The anguish of heaven itself is depicted in Jubilees, with angels weeping, creation trembling, and Adam and Eve left in unfathomable sorrow. Their first loss was the tearing away of flesh from flesh, child from child, rather than just the waning of innocence. Their sons had once been their hope for the future, but now one was buried and the other was marked with guilt. As Jubilees describes how Qabil wandered, his heart heavy with guilt, but hardened by the consequences of his own hand, the tragedy grew more profound. Instead of destroying him, the Creator spoke to him to mark him and leave a sign so that no one would knock him down. Instead of a quick death, he was punished with a life of exile and a living burden of memory. With the memories of his brother's eyes, his laughter, and the blood that had smeared the ground, he grew restless. The loss was too great for Adam and Eve to bear. They had experienced the anguish of departing from Eden, but now they tasted the anguish of death itself. Death by hand rather than by time. Their nights were plagued by Qabil's guilt, and their days were filled with the quiet of Habil's absence. They came away knowing that once sin entered a person's heart, it spread like a shadow. What had once been a single bond and family was now broken. Despite having the same parents, walking the same fields, and breathing the same air, the first brothers were strangers because of jealousy. A reminder of how brittle love can be when envy is allowed to grow. The first act of bloodshed was not only between two men, but also within the human family. Jubilees lingers on this lesson, demonstrating how violence originating from an unguarded heart, in addition to disobedience, breaks divine order. Thus, a memory of the first grave excavated into its body and the first tears shed on its face were carried by the ground. In addition to being the story of two brothers, Qabil and Habil's story became a reflection of everyone who followed them. Once watching with awe, the angels now cried and hushed their songs because they witnessed the start of a conflict that would plague humanity throughout all ages. The conflict between love and envy, between resentment and submission, and between the path of life and the path to death. When the stars moved in silent obedience to their Creator, and the celestial beings stood in awe around the throne of light, the night skies were a harmonious tapestry. However, some people in that holy order became restless and began to look down from the heavens to the earth. They observed humanity with a fervor that defied the laws of creation, a mixture of awe and longing. These angels were known as the Watchers, and they were sent to watch, protect, and observe how human life developed. However, a desire developed while they were watching, and what was intended as duty turned into temptation. This decline is hinted at in the Book of Jubilees, a tale intertwined with both grief and caution. The Watchers decided to leave their stations in heaven after being moved by what they witnessed in men's daughters. They stepped over the line that was never theirs to cross, leaving behind the light of the divine presence and dressing in mortal form. Instead of thundering or burning, they descended quietly, leaving long, heavy shadows behind them as they slipped from the heights to the earth's valleys. They didn't come into the world with nothing. They carried into the dust of men secrets of the heavens and knowledge that was forbidden. They seemed to humanity like powerful, amazing beings whose words held secrets. They taught the arts of sorcery, meta, working and reading stars, not as symbols of respect, but as means of manipulation. When something that should have only been part of divine order ended up in mortal hands, corruption quietly crept into the foundations of creation. The fruit of their union with the daughters of men was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Giants, enormous beings whose size and power defied nature, were born. These were the Nephilim, a warped representation of the design of creation that was neither entirely human nor entirely angelic. Initially, they appeared to be a wonder, strong and brilliant, with thunderous voices. However, their greatness quickly turned into a curse because their hunger increased as they grew in size and the earth was unable to support their demands. They turned against humanity itself, consuming more than flocks and fields could produce. Rivers appeared to moan beneath their thirst, and the ground shook beneath their feet. Their presence overshadowed cities, and their demands silenced villages. What had started out as awe became horror, and what had started out as fascination became fear. As a result of the Watchers' transgression, the Nephilim flooded the planet with bloodshed. They held weapons that broke the peace in their hands, which were bigger than any man's. Their voices cried out in cries of dominance rather than songs of praise. Jubilees lingers on this corruption, depicting a spiritual wound in addition to physical strength. Because the Watchers' descent brought with it more than just giants of flesh, it also brought with it the invasion of pride, the perversion of purity, and the discoloration of what had been considered sacred. Human hearts were darkened by the knowledge they shared, which taught not harmony, but violence, not wisdom, but rebellion. The weight of their decisions seemed to gnaw at the very fabric of creation and time. Once bright creatures, the Watchers were now only shadows on the ground. Their once bright faces bore the scars of rebellion. They moved among men as corruptors rather than guides, whispering secrets about spells, concoctions, and soul-binding charms. They revealed the secrets of the heavens to gain power rather than to exalt the Creator, and these gifts were given to curious and frail humanity without their cost. As the Nephilim became restless, disaster followed. Both physically and spiritually, they ate up the land. Stories of their ruthlessness, ravenousness, and unending desire proliferated. There was an unstoppable chorus of sorrow as the cries of the oppressed rose to heaven. Fathers shuddered before creatures they couldn't defeat, and mothers cried for children they had lost. Even the animals moaned under the weight of their violence, and the very soil was marred by their actions. Above, the faithful angels watched in grief, their voices raised in supplication before the throne. They witnessed their brethren who had descended, now shackled by their own decisions, and the once peaceful earth now reverberated with anarchy. Though their light appeared veiled, as if the heavens themselves were grieving, the stars continued to shine. The Watchers' decline was a tale of both rebellion and repercussions. Because what they started was difficult to reverse, even though their offspring, the giants, were not supposed to be here, they roamed the planet insatiably hungry. The equilibrium of creation itself started to tilt as a result of their pressure on the natural order, and the rumors of their corruption floated like smoke into men's dreams in the stillness of the night when everything else was silent. As if the mark of their fall were imprinted on the very calendar of heaven, the Book of Jubilees describes how this corruption was not concealed, but rather woven into the very fabric of time. What had started as a brother's jealousy had now spread to the heavens, tying men and angels together in a tale of destruction. Once guardians, the Watchers had turned into the very threat they were supposed to stop. Back then, the earth appeared older and heavier, as if the Nephilim's weight had bent its shoulders. Rivers that once sang with life now bore the silence of sorrow, and fields that once bloomed with promise were trampled underfoot. Children's laughter subsided and shepherds' songs dwindled because their world had been eclipsed. Still in its infancy, humanity now carried the scars of its own decisions, as well as the rebellion of the creatures that were supposed to rule over it. As a result, the Watcher's story is told in whispers rather than with loud declarations, as if the telling itself were significant. Their legacy was bitter, and their descent was eerie, a shadow that lasted for generations. It seems as though the stars' memory is still present in the stillness of the night when they move in a silent procession, serving as a reminder that not all falls are abrupt and not all conflicts are fought with swords. Some start with lustful looks, restless hearts, and the gradual transformation of desire into disobedience. And when such decisions are made, the earth itself remembers, bearing in its soil the cries of those who yearned for peace, the anguish of angels, and the echo of giants. Long before the first drops started to fall, the sky became heavy. It was a sorrow that seemed to reach the heavens themselves, not just a storm that was coming. With hands worn from years of work and eyes that showed both grief and obedience, Noah stood in the silence. Even though he had been warned of the impending flood that would purify the world, the weight of that knowledge still weighed heavily on his chest. Building an ark was one thing. But understanding why it was necessary was quite another. Each plank he positioned held the memory of a world that would not listen, of neighbors who shook their heads, of people who laughed at him. Every sound his hammer made sounded like a heartbeat counting down to silence as it reverberated through valleys that would soon be submerged. The ark itself emerged as a vessel of endurance rather than a magnificent palace. Its beams were shaped by shaking hands, soaked in sweat, and cut from the strength of the trees. It was large but uncomplicated, with survival, not beauty, as its goal. Noah imagined the animals that would soon occupy its hollow belly, the quiet flutter of birds that would one day carry the skies again, the restless pacing of lions, and the gentle bleating of lambs. In addition to using pitch and wood, he worked with faith that endured mockery. Even though he was always sad, every nail felt like a prayer, and every sealed joint was a whisper of trust. The rain did not fall gently when the clouds eventually broke. As if the heavens themselves were crying in agony, they poured with rage. Valleys grew darker, rivers grew larger, and the voices of those who had once made fun of him became frantic. First faint, then rising into a chorus of desperation, Noah heard the cries. But he was unable to open the ark's doors. He was not allowed to violate the order. As Noah's family huddled together in silence, their faces white in the gloom, the animals shifted restlessly within, feeling the change in the earth beneath them. The waters outside rose like a freed beast. The fields and hills that had once been the scene of laughter were gone, and the memories were swept away by the waves. Winds screamed against the ark as though to test its strength as the storm raged with a voice deeper than thunder. But inside, there was a different sound, Noah's hushed prayers, the steady creak of wood through the flood, the low breath of animals. The ark itself turned into a haven of peace amidst the turmoil outside, protecting life from the weight of condemnation. As the days went by, Noah's grief grew more intense. He was aware that generations of memories were carried away with every cresting wave. Along with the earth and stone, there was only quiet below the water's surface. No longer any villages where kids had played, gardens where hands had plowed the ground, or voices that had once risen in song. In his mind, he saw the faces of those who had laughed, and he pondered whether they had also gazed fearfully up at the sky before the end. He felt grief rather than vindication or victory. Being alive when others had died was not a victory, but a burden that weighed heavily on his soul. Life inside the ark settled into a rhythm of tenderness. The beasts were fed and their cries were quieted by Noah and his sons. Despite the pain in their own hearts, his daughters-in-law caressed feathers, brushed fur, and whispered soothing words to scared animals. With the exception of the faint glow of lamps and the constant sound of rain, the days blended into nights and the nights into days. Outside, the storm continued to roar, but inside the ark there was a rhythm of survival that was steady and silent, like the beating of an unyielding heart. After a while, something else replaced the rage of the waters. A new sort of silence descended upon the world as the never-ending roar subsided and the rain grew lighter. It was the stillness that remains after all sound has been muffled, not the silence of peace. Looking out at the horizon, Noah opened a small window. Only the boundless expanse of water remained where mountains had once risen. The world appeared to be an endless ocean engulfing the memory of the earth, a mirror of the sky. Like a leaf blown by the wind, the ark moved with the currents as it drifted. Through that silence, days went by, each one weighed down by anticipation. With their wings slicing across the immense void, Noah dispatched birds to search the horizon. His heart sank further when one came back empty-handed. The silence grew thicker when another came back exhausted and empty. However, there was a glimmer of hope when a dove finally returned with a single branch in its beak, indicating that the waters were receding and that the earth was only hidden and waiting to be revealed once more. Noah's grief softened into endurance rather than disappearing. He was aware that although it would not be the same, the earth would eventually be green once more. The memories of both laughter and defiance were buried beneath the waters, and the voices he had known would never come back. The branch in the dove's beak, however, whispered of rebirth and a world that might emerge from obscurity, purified but permanently etched by what had been lost. The air outside was still, as though creation itself was holding its breath, when the ark finally landed on the mountains. With shaky feet, Noah emerged into a starkly exposed world. The sky was clear, the ground smelled like moist soil, and there was a deep silence. There were no cities left, no voices resonating over the hills, just the soft sound of the wind blowing through the void. One by one, he led the animals out into a world that had been reborn, their cries breaking the silence. The birds spread their wings into the open sky, the lions raised their heads to the breeze, and even the tiniest of creatures stopped to listen as if they could sense the seriousness of the situation. Noah constructed an altar in the quiet following the storm. He lit the fire and arranged the stones with tired but steady hands. The smoke, a brittle link between heaven and earth, rose upward and curled into the clear sky. His heart was filled not only with thankfulness, but also with sorrow, an awareness of what had been lost and what had been saved. As if the entire universe were leaning in to observe, the silence seemed to accept his offering and hold it tenderly. After speaking in rage, the waters have now stopped speaking. What was left was a silence so profound it seemed to last forever, the silence that descends after we have shed our tears. In that silence, Noah and his family stood with the ark behind them, the world in front of them, and the sky above them, all clear and visible. Even though the flood was over, its memory persisted in the silence, the stillness, and the unsaid sorrow of survival. Sorrow and hope were carried by the smoke as it rose into the sky. They were inseparable, forever a part of the tale the earth would carry in its heart, like the ark and the waters. When the first hues appeared in the sky, the air was still damp from the memory of rain. The raging waters had receded, the storm had passed, and a silence had taken their place, one that seemed too great for any human voice to break. With his family huddled together, Noah stood on the freshly dried ground with the ark at his back. As if creation itself had been reborn, the ground surrounding them was clean and bare, stripped of its previous scars. The mountains gleamed in the pale sun, and the smell of wet soil persisted. The light then pierced the mist, bending into arcs of color that shimmered across the horizon like a soft whisper of heaven, a delicate yet majestic bridge of light, as if heaven had painted its own promise across the clouds. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Noah looked up, his heart quivering with wonder rather than fear. The flood had been harsh, unforgiving, and judgmental, but this was different. It served as a reminder that mercy had triumphed over wrath and was woven into the very fabric of the sky. His kids huddled together, their eyes wide, the youngest Holdy, nang his mother's hand as if he was worried the light would fade as fast as it had come. Still, the hues persisted, unwavering, and softly glowed over the new earth. At that moment, Noah heard words that spoke of covenant, promise, and an enduring bond between the Creator and the creation he had spared. These words came from the silence of heaven itself, not from the earth or the waters. The covenant applied to all living things, not just Noah. This vow included the animals that walked fearfully out of the ark, their paws digging into the wet earth, their fur and feathers shimmering with the last of the rain. Waters would no longer destroy the world. The flood would no longer rise to engulf every hill and stifle every voice. Beyond its aesthetic value, the rainbow served as a symbol, a seal placed on the sky, and a reminder that mercy had triumphed over judgment. The rainbow's light appeared to calm the tired hearts of those who saw it. Though Noah could still hear the faint echoes of the drowned people's cries and the memory of the storm, the colors softly enveloped the earth. Violet softened like the embrace of twilight, blue curved like the calm of endless skies, indigo deepened like night, yellow shone with the brightness of hope, green whispered of the earth that would bloom again, and red stretched like the warmth of dawn. They created a tapestry of assurance that the earth was not abandoned despite its brokenness. Still rough from years of work, Noah's hands pressed against the altar's stones. The smoke rose to mix with the mist as the fire burned softly on it. His eyes gleamed from the brightness and the tears that filled his eyes as he raised his face toward the arc of colors. He imagined future generations, children's laughter re-emerging from unplanted fields, and families erecting homes on still soft soil from rain. He considered how the rainbow would endure for a very long time after he was gone, serving as a silent reminder to everyone who looked up that they were not forgotten. The animals appeared to sense the silence as well. Now, birds that had been restless during the flood fanned out, circling beneath the colors as if on invisible hands. As if listening to the silence that shrouded the ground, a deer raised its head and pricked its ears. Even the strong and arrogant lions stood side by side, their golden eyes reflecting the glimmer of light without a snarl or claw. As the covenant encircled the heavens, creation itself appeared to stop and bow in respect. Every time the rain touched the ground as the days passed, the rainbow would reappear. Every time, it seemed as if the sky was gently reminding humanity of the unbroken bond. The fear would never return to the storms of the following years. Children would laugh beneath the rain, knowing that a rainbow was on the horizon. A silent witness to a vow made in the language of light rather than the language of men, the arc of colors would shine in the sky like a guardian. With cautious steps, Noah's family adapted to their new environment by caring for the animals, planting seeds, and relearning how to live. But each time the rain came back, they looked up, looking for the hues. As if the rainbow itself gave tired hearts courage, a silent calm descended upon them when they emerged. The memory of God's voice, preserved in color for future generations to see, was more than just beauty that spanned the sky. Noah frequently reflected on how flimsy the rainbow appeared, composed solely of light bending through mist. Nevertheless, its significance was more resilient than the seas, more resilient than mountains, and more powerful than the most ferocious stone. It reminded him that mercy was more powerful than destruction because it was both brittle and eternal, a paradox woven into the sky. He no longer shuddered when storms darkened the horizon because he knew that the covenant would shine again after the rain. He explained the meaning of the rainbow to his kids in a gentle manner. He advised them to never forget the flood, the quiet of the waters, or the light that came after. The rainbow was a gift for the future as well as for survival. They learned that the planet was not destined for perpetual cycles of destruction. It promised that their love, their prayers, their labor, and their children's children would find a foundation to stand on, a sky to gaze upon, and a season to live in. The smell of rain-fresh grass would rise as Noah sat in the fields at twilight, when the day was coming to an end and the sun was low. Even as the stars started to shine through the fading sky, the rainbow would occasionally persist, its hues softly fading, but still evoking a feeling of presence. Noah's heart would become silent during those times, and he would have the impression that heaven itself was leaning in and lulling the earth with light. The rainbow was a memory woven into the world, not just a sign. The echo of that covenant was contained in every shaft of light and every drop of rain. Noah was aware that the rainbow would still be there after his life was over, when his hands would be motionless and his voice would be quiet. The colors would reappear repeatedly, bending across the sky and whispering the same timeless promise: never again, never forgotten, never abandoned. Generations would pass, storms would rage and fade, and empires would rise and fall. Men felt safe and ambitious in the fertile, level plains of Shinar, which spanned widely under the sun. The earth's families had multiplied after the flood, dispersing over fields and valleys, their children giggling as they constructed houses, and their herds grazing on the lush grass. However, amidst the tranquility of rebirth, a murmur arose within human hearts, the aspiration to surpass the boundaries established for Hem. They dreamed of touching the boundless blue that stretched upward in the heavens above. They shared ideas and visions without barriers or divisions, speaking as one people, united by a common language. Strong and resolute, their voices reverberated in unison as they crafted plans with the same ease as they crafted clay bricks. It all started with a seed of pride that grew subtly at first. They reasoned that they could raise towers if they could raise walls. Could they not construct a monument that stood the test of time and storm if they could make bricks out of fire and earth? They talked about leaving a mark on creation itself, a name that would endure forever. They said, "Let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, so that we may not be scattered across the face of the earth." With that, the sound of labor filled the plains, with hammers pounding, fires blazing, and bricks piling one after the other. With each level constructed precisely and each stone positioned with ambition, the tower started to rise, a column reaching skyward, Men labored side by side, their backs hunched under the weight, their hands blistered, but their hearts leapt at the sight of the expanding monument. As they worked, their voices were raised in chants, and it came to represent their pride and unity. They felt invincible, united not only by a common goal, but also by a common language. They failed to recognize their pride's danger or the shadow it cast over the planet. Heaven gazed down on the city and its tower from above. It was a sight of defiance rather than beauty, of unbridled ambition rather than devotion. The tower was intended to be a challenge rather than a monument, suggesting that man could ascend into God's throne using brick and mortar. Angels, feeling the weight of what was being attempted, watched silently with their wings folded. Like smoke, the Sioux and of voices rising in one language filled the sky with a chorus of pride rather than praise. However, a choice rather than devastation came first. Touching the very foundation of their unity, their common voice, would have scattered them more thoroughly than any falling stone, but destroying the tower with fire or storm would have only left ruins. Thus, men's tongues were altered, gently but firmly. Something odd was said by a man who called out to his brother. Another screamed to get past the bricks, but the sound was a puzzle. The workers' voices clashed in discord instead of weaving together as confusion spread like a wind. They initially believed it to be a joke, then a mistake, but it was soon evident that they were no longer speaking the same language. Under the weight of miscommunication, the unity that had constructed the tower broke apart like dry clay. Men made wild gestures and yelled words that vanished into thin air, meaningless. Work stopped, arguments erupted, and the great tower remained unfinished, an empty monument to ambition undone. There were numerous tongues, dispersed like seeds by the wind, where there had once been a single people united by a single voice. The plains were filled with the sound of confusion. While one group drifted apart with their own kind, another group gathered with those who could understand their speech. While strangers were unable to communicate even the most basic words, families held on to each other, finding solace in the voices they still recognized. Each group started to stray from the plains in search of its own territory and place to call home. The tower that was supposed to reach the heavens now stood as a broken column beneath the sky, and the city that they had hoped would bind them forever became the site of their dispersal. The echoes of numerous tongues were carried by the wind that blew across Shinar. Words that had once been spoken now fell apart, crashing into one another like storm waves. A secret. Kindness, however, was concealed within the disarray since pride was subdued by their separation. They were no longer able to unite as one to confront the heavens. Rather, they turned to the land, establishing homes, cultivating fields, and raising children in places distant from the plains where the tower had risen. With each people carrying their own linguistic rhythms and melodies of thought, the world became more varied and rich in speech and song. Once dreaming of touching heaven with stone, Noah's descendants now wandered to the banks of rivers and mountains, to deserts and coasts, to valleys and forests. Life was dispersed throughout the planet, creating nations and cultures out of the linguistic muddle. What had been unity and ambition was transformed into a mosaic of voices, and what had been pride was transformed into diversity. There were now innumerable songs rising from all over creation, rather than just one proud chorus echoing through the sky. The tower itself was still standing, incomplete, its summit never meeting the clouds. Its partially constructed shape, its worn bricks, and its silent shadow would be observed by passing travelers. They would mutter about a time when people believed they could ascend to heaven on their own. The ruins served as a reminder that no matter how strong human pride was, it could not defeat God's will. The memory of the tower, the echo of a broken but transformed dream, was carried within the languages that emerged from that dispersion. The plains then became silent once more. The scaffolds were empty, the tools were left behind, and the fires that had once baked bricks were cold. The tower's long shadow swept across the ground, but it was now a monument to ambition undone rather than a symbol of unity. The murmur of long-gone voices, which once spoke as one but were now dispersed throughout the night like stars, was carried by the wind as it flowed freely through its hollow spaces. Mercy had scattered them to live, but pride had pushed them to build. The tower's story was one of a turning point rather than just failure. Stone could not reach the heavens, but humility, prayer, and hearts raised in reverence rather than defiance could. That man may rise high, but only in accordance with the will of heaven, never in opposition to it, was the message that the broken tower, standing silent beneath the clouds, whispered to everyone who passed. One line carried a silent thread of remembrance from the time when the nations were dispersed across valleys and mountains following the breaking of their speech at Babel. In addition to life, Shem, Noah's son, carried forward a sacred promise after standing reverently in the ark while the waters raged and later receiving his father's blessing. A lineage that would influence the path of history passed through him. It was selected by a silent hand directing the invisible rather than by human effort. The descendants of Shem carried the rhythm of an unfolding destiny in their blood, while the rest of the world grew restless with idols, wars, and pride. Each of Shem's children was a link in a chain that extended from the flood to Abraham's call, and their names reverberated through the generations like a chant. The line was started by Arphaxad, who was born shortly after the ark had landed on the Ararat Mountains. His sons and grandsons continued Shem's legacy by establishing their homes on the bountiful plains and producing offspring who would uphold the name. Fathers lived long enough to witness not only their children, but also their children's children grow into nations, according to the Book of Jubilees and ancient records, which described years measured in hundreds and lives spanning centuries. Instead of ruling on thrones, these men were shepherds, settlers, and travelers. Their days were characterized by the sun rising and setting, and their nights were spent under the starry sky. To their families, they were the pillars of continuity, steady and enduring, even though their names, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, and Peleg, seem like faint whispers to future generations. Eber in particular gained notoriety since his name gave rise to the people who would later be called Hebrews, a moniker that would reverberate throughout future generations. While other nations turned their hearts to wooden idols and carved stones, his household kept a reminder of the Most High. The earth itself was split during Peleg's time, with families dispersing further from the Shinar plains. Tribes established themselves in valleys, deserts, and coastal regions, and rivers and mountains served as borders. Like an old scar, the memory of the tower lingered, but men ignored its warning and went back to their pride, worshipping their clay and wood gods and offering incense to the hosts of heaven rather than the one who created them. But through Shem's line, a more subdued root persisted, resembling a secret stream beneath arid terrain. It flowed steadily, waiting for the time to rise, but it did not rush with grandeur or noise. The names went on, from Peleg to Ro, from Ro to Serug, each man fathering sons, each generation passing on the promise. Terah, Abram's father, was born from Nahor. Idols and shrines were already proliferating all around them, and the worship of false gods was becoming more and more prevalent. Temples rose with cities, altars smoked with sacrifices, and voices raised prayers to human-made images rather than the creator of heaven and earth. However, a child was born in Terah's home who would be called to leave these shadows behind and walk in the promise of the stars. There was no thunder or flame to announce Abraham's birth. Like all children, he was born peacefully, nestled in his mother's arms, sleeping under the same sky that had protected Shem. However, heaven marked him with the whisper of fate rather than visible signs. Through centuries of wandering, through generations that came and went without ever realizing the fullness of what they held, the line from Shem had been preserved for this very moment. The covenant maintained by Shem and the promise sown in Noah's blessing started to come alive in Abraham. Voices calling to idols filled the surrounding area as Abraham grew. His family lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, where the moon god was revered and the night sky was crowded with prayers, not to the Creator, but to the stars themselves. Incense rose from altars everywhere, and the landscape was peppered with towers and shrines. According to legend, Terra created idols out of wood and stone, their faces lifeless and fixed, yet revered by the populace as if they controlled the heavens. Abraham, a young boy, observed these rituals with a restless heart, possibly sensing at the time that such worship was pointless. But a memory of truth had been preserved in Shem's lineage. Even though it was dim and obscured by the clamor of false gods, it persisted. Stories about the ark, the waters that once encased the earth, and the covenant that God had made with Noah were still told by some elders. They talked about Shem's blessing and the God who created the stars, who intended for them to shine as symbols of his glory rather than to be worshipped. When Abraham heard these murmurs, he looked up at the sky, and even though everything around him was bowing down to idols, something inside of him stirred. He saw the stars as lanterns lit by the one who held everything, not as gods. Destiny was playing out in a subtle, nearly imperceptible woe. Men had lived and died, generations had come and gone, and their names were written down like beads on a string. However, this child was the result of all the connections in Terah's family. The promise was steady, built over centuries, and neither loud nor abrupt. The divine hand had molded this family's path, just as rivers sculpt valleys over a long period of time. Eber, Peleg, Nahor, Terah, and finally Abraham, who would soon be called to leave his homeland and venture into the unknown, received Shem's blessing. Abraham's birth story serves as a reminder that fate doesn't always strike with trumpet calls or lightning. There are times when it happens quietly, in the cadence of births and lives passed down through the generations, or in the patient weaving of generations. Centuries of waiting, silent faithfulness, and seemingly ordinary lives that were a part of something bigger stretched from Shem to Abraham. And as Abraham grew older, the thread of that promise, carried so meticulously and for such a long time, was prepared to be unveiled on a journey that would alter not just his life, but also the course of history. In addition to being a story of travel and promises, Abraham's story also reveals a sequence of intense hardships that tried the very foundation of his character. He defied the norms of both his own family and the culture in which he was raised. Abraham's spirit struggled with issues too significant for his youth, while his father Terah and the people of Ur bowed before inanimate idols made of clay and stone. He knew that the stars, which were so numerous and bright above him, could not be gods. He realized that the elements obeyed a higher power after witnessing fire devour wood and water put out flames. Since few people shared his vision of the invisible, his faith did not start out easily. Rather, it was forged out of loneliness. He stood out for his courage when he spoke out against idols. Abraham is said to have defiantly destroyed his father's idols, leaving only the biggest one intact. When asked why, he merely replied that the great idol must have destroyed the others. His audacity made him stand out and was a source of pride for a society that worshipped false deities. He declared that creation had a maker who was greater than pictures and statues, and his voice rose like a tiny flame in a shadow-shrouded city. Such a conviction came at a high price. He endured mockery, rage, and even threats against his life, but his heart refused to give in because something inside of him sparked a truth that would not be kept quiet. Abraham experienced both internal and external hardships. He was drawn to a solitary path by faith. He stood by himself, staring up at the sky and muttering prayers to the one who could not be seen, while others found camaraderie in the worship of idols. In the quiet of nights when even the stars seemed far away, loneliness pressed down on him like a cloak. But his heart was refined in this silence. It seemed as though the loneliness itself turned into a furnace where bravery was created. He became more determined to have faith only in the eternal for each idol he turned away from and each shrine he passed. It was more than just a geographical journey when the divine voice finally told him to leave his land and his father's household. It was a tearing away of all that provided a man with stability. Abraham was asked to follow his faith alone as he ventured into the unknown. Behind him lay the land of Ur, its towers reaching skyward, its river teeming with life, its busy markets, mountains, deserts, and an uncharted destiny awaited them. The heartache of leaving behind loved ones, memories, and the comfortable, familiar surroundings of home was just as much of a trial as physical difficulties of travel. To obey was to abandon everything he had known in the hope that the one who had summoned him would not abandon him. Abraham's heart was put to the test while he was waiting. He had heard promises of a land full of blessings, of nations that would arise from his line, and of descendants as numerous as the stars. But as the years went by, the promise didn't seem very real. His household aged with him, and his tents continued to be devoid of children's laughter. There is a heavy void in waiting because longing for a son is tantamount to longing for a legacy and a future that extends beyond one's own life. Abraham's heart was put to the test every day. Sarah's arms remained empty, and he wondered if the promise had been forgotten. Nevertheless, he held on to hope despite his weakness. On bright nights, he looked up at the sky and recalled the voice telling him to count the stars if he could. Even though he was filled with longing, the lights overhead served as a reminder that the promise was unconstrained by human time. His bravery lay in his decision to believe despite doubt pressing fiercely against his soul, not in the absence of doubt. Abraham showed courage by continuing to believe that the one who had spoken would carry out his word, even though all he could see was silence and delay. Other hardships included times when famine struck and Abraham was forced to flee to Egypt, where he struggled with uncertainty and fear. On some nights when his enemies rose against him, he led his family into battle with bravery that came from faith in the invisible rather than from sheer numbers. He became stronger as a result of each of these hardships, becoming a man capable of carrying the burden of covenant. Each trial stripped him of his dependence on himself and taught him to fully rely on the divine hand guiding his path. They were not punishments, but rather refinements. Abraham's bravery was put to the ultimate test in the most intimate way possible, not in the presence of adversaries or the emptiness of waiting. Joy filled the tents, Sarah's voice resumed its laughter, and Abraham's heart grew with satisfaction when the long-awaited son, Isaac, was finally born. But the voice of God returned, this time with an order to sacrifice his beloved son, a command that went deeper than any previous trial. Because it appeared to go against the very promise made, the command was a mystery too great to handle. Abraham, however, stood up in obedience, his heart broken and his steps heavy, but he never wavered in his faith that the one who made the promise could also keep it. Even though the knife never fell on Isaac, Abraham's heart had already given up everything at this test, which was the pinnacle of all his hardships and the moment when faith was demonstrated in deeds rather than words. Abraham's life became a testament to the fact that faith is a journey of endurance rather than ease as he endured each hardship. He went through the heartbreak of leaving home, the loneliness of standing up to idols, the anguish of giving up what he loved most, the fear of enemies, and the sadness of waiting for a child. But throughout it all, his bravery was a constant flame that never went out rather than a sudden outburst of strength. His heart shook but did not shatter when it was put to the test like gold in the fire. Abraham's hardships ultimately made him a friend of God, a man whose heart beat in time with faith despite all the evidence that seemed to be against him. His bravery lay in his quiet strength to believe when it seemed impossible, to hope when it seemed futile, and to trust when it required everything, not in conquering nations or erecting monuments. Abraham stood under the enormous canopy of the heavens one night. Around him, the desert. was silent, only disturbed by the sound of the wind rustling the sands. The stars above burned in incalculable numbers, strewn across an endless black canvas like diamonds. Their brightness cut through the stillness, and Abraham felt the weight of eternity bearing down on him as he looked up. Despite his lengthy journey and years of waiting and promises, there was still silence in his household's tents where there should have been a child's laughter. The voice of the divine returned in that silent moment, under the icy light of the stars, soft but powerful, and filled the night with an immeasurable presence. With imagery as limitless as the sky above him, the promise was spoken. Abraham was given the measure of his future when he was instructed to look up and, if he could, try to count the stars. The voice said that his descendants would be as many as the stars he saw, an uncountable number. The stars, which had previously appeared far away and inaccessible, were transformed from silent nighttime decorations into living representations of covenant and witnesses woven into the very fabric of creation. After years of waiting, Abraham's heart began to beat with a newfound sense of hope, because the promise had even captivated the heavens. The stars were more than just lights to Abraham. The one who created them now used them as a symbol of his word in a world where men frequently bowed before them as gods. His time's beliefs were reversed. The Creator ruled both men and stars, not the stars ruling men. Their genius now spoke of blessing and promise rather than fate or superstition. The vastness of the cosmos, which had previously served as a reminder of his isolation, was now a work of art. Every glimmer of light overhead turned into a prophecy, and every constellation served as a reminder that his tale would endure well beyond his own life. Abraham undoubtedly went outside his tent to gaze at the sky again on numerous evenings following that vision. The stars spoke again each time. Their soft glow reminded him of the voice that had spoken when doubt pressed against him. He raised his eyes and recalled the crowd above when Sarah's arms were still empty. The stars assured him that nations would emerge from him that no adversary could destroy when his fear of enemies increased. As silent but unwavering reminders that the covenant was still in existence, the stars became his waiting companions. Abraham's heart was thus permanently bonded to the promise under those ancient skies. The stars provided him with a vision beyond the here and now. But his journey was still paved with obstacles and his days were still full of faith tests. He saw the generations that would emerge from his line, the nations that would walk the earth bearing his legacy, and the children he had not yet born in them, as though the light of the heavens would one day reach every part of the earth. The stars whispered not only of descendants, but also of blessings that would spread to the entire world. The covenant was written in that silent exchange between earth and sky as Abraham stood beneath the stars, his heart agitated and his eyes raised. It was inscribed on the very fabric of the universe rather than on parchment or stone tablets. The sky itself became the unending, luminous, and everlasting text of his promise. Like the majority of Abraham's most trying times, the journey started in silence. When he saddled his donkey and took his son Isaac and 2 servants with him, the sun had just begun to rise, casting soft gold over the horizon. His heart had been rocked by the command, which had come softly, like a whisper in the night. He had been instructed to take the son of promise, the one for whom he had waited all his life, the one whose laughter had lifted Sarah's tired heart, and present him as a sacrifice on a mountain. There were no recorded questions, no negotiations like those with Sodom, and no request for a different course of action. The only thing that kept him together was a silent obedience that was painful and heavy, as though words alone would have broken the delicate bond. They walked for 3 days. The journey was slow, the air was still, the ground was dry, and the wilderness surrounded them indefinitely. Abraham's face revealed nothing, but every step was a burden on his heart. He had learned to believe even when the night sky spoke silently, to trust and to walk without answers. Nevertheless, This command was pressed more forcefully than any previous test. Isaac, the very personification of the promise Abraham had received, walked next to him, naive and uninformed. He served as a reminder of Abraham's love for him and the impossibility of the task that lay at the top of the mountain, and his presence was both consoling and agonizing. Abraham raised his eyes to get a distant view of the location on the third day. Maybe he felt sad when he saw it, because the mountain was silent and unyielding, like a sentinel, waiting to see what would happen on its summits. He turned to his servants and instructed them to stay behind with the donkey, leaving him and Isaac to proceed alone. He said to them, "We will worship," and then, in words that must have shuddered as they came out of his mouth, "and we will return to you." Only Abraham knew whether those words were spoken in faith or as a flimsy barrier against hopelessness. They dared to hope that obedience would not result in defeat, though, and hung in the air like a silent prophecy. The son bore the weight of the sacrifice as Isaac carried the wood on his back. Together they climbed in silence after Abraham took the knife and the fire. However, silence cannot last forever, and Isaac's question, accompanied by his youthful innocence, broke it. "My father," he said quietly, "the wood and fire are here, but where is the lamb for the offering?" Abraham was deeply troubled by the words, but he responded calmly, as if in prayer, "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." Isaac accepted this without question, his faith as unwavering as his father's approach to the altar. Stone by stone, Abraham erected the altar at the summit, his hands shaking as he did so. The sky above was wide and vigilant, and the air was thin. Every action seemed to be a ritual of surrender, as evidenced by the meticulous arrangement of the wood. Words can hardly describe the moment that followed. Abraham turned to Isaac, bound him with cords, and placed him on the wood. The beating of two hearts, one steady in trust and the other trembling in agony, was the only sound to break the dense silence. According to the story, Isaac did not resist. His obedience was similar to that of his father, as if Abraham's faith had been instilled in him verbally. 2 generations came together to surrender at the altar, one in action and the other in submission. The knife, shining in the light, was raised. Time must have slowed, with each heartbeat seeming to go on forever. Abraham's entire world, his love, his promise, and his very future, was perilously close to collapse at that moment. The stars that once whispered covenant must have held their breath as the heavens leaned in close. Then the silence broke at the very edge. A voice called out, demanding and urgent, "Abraham! Abraham!" The words that followed relieved the tension in the world. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he replied, his voice trembling. "Here I am. Don't do anything to him. Since you haven't abandoned your only son, I can now tell that you fear God." Abraham must have exhaled quickly as he lowered the knife, as if the mountain were also exhaling. He looked up again and saw a ram ensnared by its horns in a thicket. A provision was ready and waiting to be revealed, but it was not an ordinary sight. As a sign of faith and deliverance, Abraham offered the ram in place of Isaac, and the smoke from the sacrifice rose into the sky. The altar, which had appeared to be a place of death just a moment before, was now a place of life. Despite being put to the test by fire, the father-son bond remained strong after Isaac stepped down alive. On that day, the mountain was given a new name: "The Lord will provide," because it was demonstrated on that height that even when obedience was put to the ultimate test, it was met with more than expected provision. The pledge was reiterated with even more vigor. The voice from heaven spoke again, blessing Abraham. All the nations of the earth would be blessed through his seed, and his descendants would number as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach. With its quiet stones and smoky atmosphere, the altar evolved into a site of both testing and rebirth, where the covenant was more intense than before. Even though Isaac's thoughts are not expressed in the text, the memory must have persisted. Such an experience ingrains itself in the soul, being bound on the wood, witnessing the knife raised above him, and then being spared. Perhaps he never forgot the ram stuck in the thicket that served as his stand-in, or the trust in his father's eyes. The altar, a silent scar of memory that hinted at divine provision, became as much a part of his story as it was of Abraham's. Like a dream, the images of that day resurface, the sound of a ram's horns rustling in the branches, the shadow of a raised hand, the flicker of firelight against stone, and the sound of silent footsteps on a mountain path. Against the open sky, the altar represented both promise and fear. It was the moment when provision overcame despair, when human obedience and divine mercy met, and when voice replaced silence. The mountain persisted, serving as a reminder to everyone who would hear the tale that a God who provides beyond comprehension met faith that was put to the ultimate test. Now the image of the ram trapped in the thicket was tied to the memory of stars promising innumerable descendants. Both mentioned covenants. One was sealed on the altar of the mountain, the other was written in the heavens. It must have been easier for Abraham to descend that mountain than it must have been to ascend it. The promise was still burning in his heart as his son walked next to him, still alive. Once a place of shadows, the altar was now a place of light, and the whisper of blessing had replaced the silence of obedience. Though they were not alike, they were born as twins. Their rivalry was evident from the moment of their birth as Jacob followed Esau, his small hand clutching his brother's heel as he first appeared, red and cloaked in hair like a garment. As if Jacob had always reached forward, yearning for what lay ahead, that one gesture became a shadow over their lives. Long before they were born, their mother, Rebekah, had been bearing the burden of their struggle, feeling them struggle inside her womb. When she asked for an explanation, she was informed that she was a woman of two nations, with the older serving the younger. Though its significance was concealed in the fabric of their lives until time would bring it to light, it was a prophecy that laid the groundwork for everything that would happen. Esau developed into a powerful, erratic, and wild man of the fields. His hands were as strong as a hunter's, and his skin was tanned. Jacob, on the other hand, was quiet, lived among the tents, and was attentive. Rebekah preferred Jacob because she sensed the promise whispered to her when he was still unborn, but their father Isaac preferred Esau because the game he brought to the table moved the old man. Rivalry would deepen in the family, which was split along affectional lines. Over a bowl of stew, the first fracture occurred in silence. The smell of Jacob's lentils filled the air as Esau, exhausted from the hunt, returned one day. He was so weak that he demanded food as hunger held him like chains. Ever the calculating one, Jacob saw an opening there. In return, he demanded Esau's birthright, which was the blessing and inheritance due to the firstborn. Esau might have dismissed the significance of a birthright in favor of the agonizing pain of hunger. "If I die of starvation, what good is a birthright to me?" he said. Thus, Jacob quietly acquired what he had long wanted, and Esau sold what was sacred with the ease of a thoughtless word and the taste of stew on his tongue. The trade of hunger set destiny in motion, so even though the moment seemed insignificant, it carried the weight of entire nations. Isaac grew older as the years went by. He felt the shadow of death approaching as his eyes grew so dim that he was unable to see. In order to bless him before he passed away, he summoned his favorite son, Esau, and asked him to hunt and cook. More than just words, a father's blessing included inheritance, power, and the making of a covenant. Rebekah heard, and the promise that the older would serve the younger stirred her heart. Calling Jacob, she urged him to take advantage of the blessing intended for Esau. Fearing discovery, Jacob paused, but his mother's perseverance forced him to continue. She made the food, put Jacob in Esau's clothes, and covered his hands and neck with goatskin to simulate his brother's rough skin. Jacob approached his father, speaking in a shaky voice. "Who are you, my son?" inquired Isaac, suspicious. Jacob replied, I am Esau, your firstborn." Although the words were a betrayal, he persisted. Unsure, Isaac felt the goatskin's roughness on his hands. He inhaled the aroma of the clothing, the field's scent clinging to Jacob. The old man was a little confused, but the trick was sufficient. He spoke over Jacob to bless him, saying things like abundance, nations bowing, and mastery over his brothers. Through guile and disguise, Jacob was able to inherit the covenantal weight from his father, not Esau as Isaac had intended. Esau returned a few moments later with his hunt and his food ready, eagerly awaiting the blessing. After he went in and offered his food, the truth was revealed to him. It was impossible to reverse the blessing that had already been spoken. Esau's cry, raw and bitter, rose like a storm as Isaac shuddered violently. "Bless me, Father, me too." But after realizing what had happened, Isaac was only able to say that Jacob had come dishonestly and taken what was rightfully his. Esau's voice reverberated through the tents as he sobbed out loud, his sorrow and betrayal resonating. He would live by the sword, away from the wealth of the land, serving his brother but eventually escaping. And Isaac gave him words, but not the blessing he desired. Esau's heart ached from the hatred he felt that day. Vengeance took root as the brotherhood was ripped apart. He made a deep-seated vow to murder Jacob when the time for grieving his father arrived. When Rebekah learned of this, she encouraged Jacob to escape to Haran and stay with her brother Laban until Esau's rage subsided. Jacob left his house, his mother's tears trailing behind him, bearing the blessing and the consequences of his deeds. Their rivalry is depicted in the book of Jubilees as a struggle shaped by fate rather than just a dispute between men. It remembers how they fought within their mother as kids, as if the fight for inheritance had already started. While Jacob is depicted as wise and patient, waiting for the promise, Esau is described in Jubilees as impatient, easily enraged, and a man of the hunt who lived for the moment. The conflict between the two nations is presented as one that their descendants will have to fight over the ages. Jacob's guile in this story was not random. Rather, it was a manifestation of divine plan, albeit one that was tainted by human weakness and dishonesty. However, there are some dark aspects to the story for Jacob. He was blessed, but he also had to live in exile and be afraid. With only a staff in his hand, he left his house with an uncertain future but a burning promise in his heart. He was followed by his brother's hatred, and the blessing came with loneliness because he was no longer protected by his father's tents. Strong, scarred, and with a resentment that would not go away easily, Esau stayed behind. Two brothers, separated by treachery but united by blood, left their mark on the world by their decisions, influencing not only their own lives but also the lives of their offspring. Even now, the feelings of that moment are still present. Jacob's silence as he carried the burden of his actions, Isaac's shaking when he realized he had been duped, and Esau's unadulterated cry when he discovered his blessing had been taken away. It is a tale of rivalry seeping into fate, betrayal becoming the foundation for covenant, and the meeting of human weakness and divine purpose. Isaac's tents carried both grief and silence in the quiet aftermath. Jacob's absence created a void, Esau's rage burned, and Rebekah, who had pushed for the plan, bore the weight of being apart from her son. The burden of decisions that could not be reversed fell on the household. The future had been shaped, the words sealed, and the blessing spoken. Despite having been born together, the two brothers now followed different paths, their rivalry reverberating through the generations and bound to have an impact well beyond their own lives. Under the burden of his decisions, Jacob wandered with the pain of exile on his shoulders and the blessing in his heart. He fled Esau's wrath by walking into the wilderness by himself, away from his father's tents. With every step, he moved farther away from everything he knew, and the desolate terrain in front of him seemed to understand his loneliness as well. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, pleading with him to seek safety with her brother. But the journey was lengthy, and he harbored a silent fear of being pursued. As evening approached and the first stars appeared in the sky, Jacob looked for a spot to sleep. There was nothing but the open air, no bed or tent. He picked up a stone, set it under his head, and lay down on the ground. The veil between heaven and earth thinned as he fell asleep. He saw a vision that was unlike anything he had ever seen with his waking eyes. Light glowed on the rungs of a ladder that rose from the earth where he lay to the very tops of heaven. Angels passed over it in a never-ending rhythm, rising and falling, their bodies like living fires, silent but intent. As if the ladder were a bridge connecting the splendor of heaven and the dust of earth, they moved between realms. Still in his dream, Jacob watched this scene in wonder, his breath caught in the silence of that sacred moment. The Lord, clad in mystery, stood at the top of the ladder, majestic and close. Instead of thunder, his voice filled the air and gently pressed against Jacob's heart. I am the Lord, the God of Isaac, and the God of Abraham, your father. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you lie. You will disperse to the west, east, north, and south, and your descendants will be as numerous as the dust on the earth. All families on earth will be blessed through you and your seed. Look, I'm with you. I'll be with you wherever you go, and I'll return you to this country. I won't abandon you until I've fulfilled everything I said. The words soothed Jacob's restless spirit like a salve. He was reminded in this dream that he was not abandoned, even though he had fled his home in terror, unsure of what was ahead. Despite his weakness and the deceit that had characterized his path, Isaac now possessed the promise that had been made to Abraham and then renewed to him. The angel's movements on the ladder appeared to reflect the invisible concern that encircled him. They were God's messengers, connecting the splendor of heaven with the dust of the earth where Jacob slept, as though time had stopped to allow him to witness a secret woven into creation, that heaven was not far away but rather close by, with invisible steps constantly navigating between the realms. The dream glistened with the fantastical. The night was still surrounding Jacob when he woke up, but the atmosphere had changed as a result of the presence he had witnessed. The stone beneath his head had transformed from a place of rest to the entrance to heaven. He trembled and muttered, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." Wonder and fear mixed together as he sensed the holiness of the ground he was lying on. He got up, took the stone, and poured oil on it as a sacrifice before setting it upright as a pillar. Because the veil had been lifted and heaven had leaned near earth in that desolate location, he gave it the name Bethel, which means the house of God. Then, not through haggling but through trust, Jacob vowed that the Lord would be his God if he would keep him, give him food and clothing, and return him to his father's home in peace. He would return a portion in honor from everything that was given to him, and the stone he had set up would serve as a witness and a house of God. It was the voice of a man who had been transformed by vision and who had encountered mystery while traveling alone. The vision's dreamlike quality persisted in him for a long time, because dreams tend to hang on like shadows even after the sun comes up. The ladder, which extended from the ground to the sky, symbolized a hidden but constant connection. The angel's ascent and descent demonstrated that the world is not empty and that invisible entities move with intention, silently bridging realms, guarding paths, and carrying messages. It was comforting to know that he was not alone in the wilderness for a tired and burdened Jacob. His life, which was characterized by conflict and exile, was a part of a greater narrative in which the heavens themselves took part. The weight of fate was also present in the vision. In the dream, Jacob was promised a future as vast as the earth's dust, with his descendants dispersed throughout the world, despite the fact that he had left home with nothing but a staff and no idea of the path ahead. Fruitfulness, a covenant developing silently in the night, was the blessing, not just survival. In his dream, the ladder appeared to whisper that God's promises extended beyond altars and tents and met him alone in the middle of the night. The dream would serve as a window into the mystery of God's presence for generations to come. The revelation that heaven and earth are not separated, and that the Eternal One walks with humans even when they wander, was in addition to the angelic vision. Jacob's vision at Bethel would serve as a landmark, a story told around fires, and a reminder that God's promises are unwavering and heaven is close, even on the most desolate nights. The wilderness didn't feel quite so empty as Jacob continued his journey following the vision. The encounter site was marked by the stone pillar, but his soul was marked by the memory inside of him. He was reminded of the words uttered from the heights by every glance at the stars above, and every step carried the echo of angels' feet upon invisible rungs. He walked with the knowledge that he was accompanied, and that heaven itself had bowed down to reassure him of the covenant's unfolding, even though his exile persisted and his trials were still ahead. The latter dream was more than just a glimpse of the divine. It was a reminder to the tired heart that the Eternal One never gives up, and that even the wilderness can be a place of worship. The vision changed fear into reverence and loneliness into promise for Jacob, who was lying on the ground with a stone for a pillow. As a living reminder that the invisible world is interwoven with the earth's dust, and that the God of Abraham and Isaac was now the God of Jacob, the angel's ascent and descent stayed imprinted in his spirit, supporting him at every turn on his journey. In the peaceful valleys where sheep grazed and the scent of grass and earth filled the air, Joseph's life began. He was Rachel's child, Jacob's cherished son, and the object of his father's affection that went beyond words. His youth exuded a brightness that set him apart from his brothers because Jacob had dressed him in a coat made of colors that glistened in the sunlight. It was a reminder of their father's favor and a silent burden of jealousy on their hearts. But to Joseph, it was a gift of love, a father's embrace sewn into fabric. In his naivete, however, Joseph openly discussed the dreams that it awoke inside him and hinted at a future beyond his current comprehension. He would dream of sheaves in the field, his own sheaf standing erect while his brothers' sheaves bowed around it in the stillness of the night. Unaware of the storm it would cause in their hearts, he told them about it in a voice full of wonder. The dream seemed to lift him above them, a vision they could not bear, so their faces darkened and their silence grew heavy. His young heart could not contain such mysteries in silence, so he eagerly shared his dream, which again showed the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing low before him. Because he knew that dreams could be more than just the shadows of sleep, Jacob listened to him with both concern and awe, reprimanding him externally while holding the words close to his heart. However, for his brothers, the dreams served as fuel for their jealousy, which smoldered day by day until it turned into a fierce resolve. While caring for the flocks far from home, they plotted in silence and spoke softly. They were filled with resentment that was too intense to control when they saw Joseph approaching them in his multicolored coat. They whispered, "Look, this dreamer is here." And their rage surged with those words. Reuben, the oldest, tried to protect him from death and convinced them to cast him into a pit, but they decided to end him there, to permanently silence the dream. Unaware of their intentions, Joseph approached with the brotherly confidence of a brother before being apprehended, stripped of his coat, and cast into the pit's darkness. There was silence all around him and no water to quench his thirst in the empty pit. His brothers' voices responded to his cry with icy coldness. Unaffected by his cries, he could hear their laughter and the sound of bread breaking as they ate from above. Then the caravan arrived, merchants from Gilead making their way down to Egypt on camels loaded with myrrh, balm, and spices. Judah's voice rose among the brothers, urging them to sell him because there would be no benefit to allowing him to pass away in secret. They decided it would be better to send him away and get rid of him. So silver was traded, and Joseph was raised out of the pit only to be given to strangers. He looked into their eyes one final time, hoping for pity, but they looked away. His heart broke with every step as he traveled the long and exhausting road to Egypt. As a young boy, he was separated from his father's affection and forced to live with traders who spoke strange languages. Tears filled his eyes, blurring the land around him, but a faint light flickered deep within the memory of his dreams. The whispers of fate lingered, as silent as the desert wind, but he still did not understand them or see how the path of betrayal could lead to promise. In the meantime, his brothers returned the multicolored coat to Jacob after dipping it in goat blood. Their father's heart broke with sorrow when he saw it, ripped and discolored. He ripped his clothes, wrapped himself in sackcloth, and cried with an indescribable grief. His sobs filled the tents as he lamented a son he thought had been eaten by untamed animals. No hand could take away his grief, no word could ease his pain, for he refused to be consoled, saying he would mourn his son until the end of time. While Joseph's life was carried into the unknown far away, his grief cast a shadow over the home. Joseph was sold again in Egypt, this time to Potiphar, a Pharaoh's officer. He was surrounded by the magnificence of Egypt, with its tall temples, its stone-carved gods, and its peculiar language. Despite being separated from his family and his freedom in this strange land, he possessed a quiet fortitude that appeared to come from the invisible hand of his father's God. Even though he had been deceived, he had not been left behind, and the dreams that had once made his brothers jealous now hung there like seeds, waiting to sprout. Egypt's nights were distinct, with the hum of a city that never slept and the steady flow of the Nile seemingly bearing the weight of entire nations. Once the son of a shepherd, Joseph now worked in a stranger's home. Even so, his heart held on to the glimmer of promise, and his spirit remained unwavering. He was reminded that the story was not yet complete by the lingering image of sheaves bending low and stars bowing. For the time being, he followed the path of servitude, his hands occupied with work and his voice subdued in submission. Instead of ending in despair, the journey that started with betrayal had just started to weave itself into an invisible tapestry. He was being shaped by each step, each grief, and each gentle recollection, readying him for what was beyond his line of sight. Even though he was unaware of it at the time, the dreams of his childhood were still alive and waiting for the whispers to rise like a song fulfilled, hidden in the quiet of God's timing. When Joseph, despite his innocence, was thrown into the shadows of a prison, the days in Egypt took on a darker hue. Silence hung heavy on the stone walls, broken only by the clinking of iron and the echo of footsteps. Once wearing a coat of colors and walking freely in his father's tents, he was now a servant in chains, punished for a crime he had not committed. Although Potiphar's hands had been blessed in every task and his home had been a place of rising hope, he had been brought low by false accusations and jealousy. Even though Potiphar may have sensed the truth, he let anger and appearances determine Joseph's fate after his wife made a poisoned accusation against him, leaving him helpless. As a result, the young Hebrew was taken away by Egypt's underworld as a prisoner rather than as a dependable servant of a master. Joseph's spirit, however, remained intact despite being imprisoned in empty chambers. Inside the prison walls, he felt the same presence that had accompanied him in Canaan and Potiphar's home. The keeper noticed his steady and composed demeanor and gave him tasks that were typically reserved for people in chains. He moved among the other inmates as one who was quietly upheld rather than broken, establishing order where despair threatened. Despite the fact that the prison was a place of forgotten men, Joseph's heart remained connected to an invisible God who used his hardships as training. Two of Pharaoh's personal servants, the chief baker and cupbearer, were among the inmates. Both had fallen out of favor and were now living in the same shadows as Joseph. Their faces became troubled in the stillness of the night because they had been visited by dreams that they were unable to comprehend. When Joseph saw their sadness one morning, he gently inquired as to why their faces were somber. Admitting that they couldn't find an interpreter, they told him about their dreams. With a silent assurance in his eyes, Joseph answered, "Don't interpretations belong to God? I beg you to tell them to me." First to speak, The cupbearer described a vine in front of him that had 3 branches that were budding, blossoming, and producing clusters of ripe grapes. He placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand after pressing the grapes into it. Joseph calmly, assuredly listened and said, "The 3 branches were 3 days." In 3 days, Pharaoh would put the cupbearer back in his proper position and hand the cup to him again. Encouraged, the baker told of his dream: 3 baskets of white bread on his head, with a variety of baked goods for Pharaoh in the top basket. However, the birds arrived and feasted on them. This time Joseph's words were sorrowful and heavy. The 3 baskets represented 3 days, and during that time Pharaoh would raise the baker's head, but not to restore him. Instead, he would hang him and the birds would consume his flesh. Because he had been taken from his land and wrongfully imprisoned, Joseph only asked the cupbearer to remember him and treat Pharaoh with kindness when he was restored. Days went by, and just as Joseph had predicted, the baker was put to death and the cupbearer was put back in his place. However, in the return to comfort, the cupbearer forgot Joseph, and his promise was forgotten. Joseph stayed behind bars, his faith waiting patiently while his hope endured through long days and longer nights. Then, dreams that roused even Pharaoh himself broke the year's silence. First, 7 svelte, well-fed cows emerged from the Nile to graze in the reeds in the night visions. Then came 7 more cows, all of them ugly and gaunt, and they ate the fat cows and didn't gain any weight. In a second dream, 7 full ears of grain grew on one stalk, but 7 thin ears that had been burned by the east wind appeared next, and the full ears were swallowed. Pharaoh woke up with a restless mind and a troubled spirit. None of the Egyptian wise men and magicians he called upon were able to provide interpretation. Fear echoed through the palace, and his heart continued to be confused. The cupbearer remembered then. Feeling guilty, he told Pharaoh about a Hebrew young man he had met in prison who had a truthful ability to interpret dreams. Joseph was immediately dispatched by Pharaoh and quickly taken from the dungeon. After being cleaned and dressed, he was presented to the throne. Despite the court's scrutiny, Joseph seemed composed as he stood in front of Egypt's ruler. He was told the dreams by Pharaoh, who acknowledged that no one could explain their significance. In a humble response, Joseph said that God would provide Pharaoh with a peaceful response because it was not in him. Then he revealed the secret. The 7 good ears and 7 good cows represented 7 years of plenty, when the land would produce abundantly. The land would become barren after 7 years of famine, which was symbolized by the 7 thin ears and the 7 gaunt cows. Because the dream was divinely established and would undoubtedly come to pass, it had doubled. Joseph provided advice with wisdom well beyond his years. He didn't stop at interpretation. In the years of plenty, let the Pharaoh designate a wise man to oversee the land, assign officers to collect 1/5 of the produce, and store it in cities under his control. The land would not die, and Egypt would have reserves to support her people when the famine struck. Pharaoh and his servants were moved by his words, which were delivered with quiet confidence rather than arrogance. "Can we find someone like this, a man who embodies the Spirit of God?" Pharaoh inquired. He pronounced Joseph to be the one after glancing at him. In one day, Joseph was raised from prisoner to ruler. Joseph was dressed in exquisite linen, had a gold chain around his neck, and the Pharaoh placed his own signet ring on his hand. "Bow the knee," cried the heralds as he rode in Pharaoh's second chariot. The young Hebrew, who had previously been thrown into a pit and forgotten in a dungeon, was now the second in command of all of Egypt after Pharaoh. The voice of a foreigner was now heard in Egypt, a country full of temples and the splendor of its monarchs. Carrying the weight of both plenty and starvation, Joseph no longer roamed its streets as a slave, but as a leader. Silent years of grief had preceded his ascent, but each hardship had etched in him a patience and wisdom that now gleamed like the sun after a storm. He passed through the halls of Pharaoh with a calm dignity, carrying with him the memory of dreams from long ago that had appeared to be the reason for his demise, but were now the catalyst for his ascent. Egypt looked to him with hope, but the echo of home, the voice of his father, the betrayal of his brothers, the dreams that started under the Canaanite stars, remained in his heart. They waited for the moment when those strewn-about fragments would find their place in the developing narrative, hovering beneath Egypt's golden ceilings like whispers. Egypt's night was silent, but beneath the stillness, a silent stirring of fate was beginning to take shape. Once welcomed into the land by Joseph's favor, the children of Israel now moaned under the burden of bondage. Their lives had been consumed by labor, their cries absorbed by the walls of a land that glittered with wealth but grew cruel with suspicion, and they had been transformed from esteemed guests into slaves due to Pharaoh's fear. During this dark period, a decree as sharp as a blade began to circulate among Egyptian households. The daughters were spared, but every son born to the Hebrews was to be thrown into the Nile and drowned beneath the waters that gave Egypt its existence. Fathers' hearts were filled with helplessness, and mothers' eyes were filled with fear as this command hung over every home like a storm. The secret weight of life was carried by a woman in the tribe of Levi, whose heart was divided between fear and hope. When her labor pains finally subsided, she held a son in her arms, a child whose face seemed to glow with a brightness too bright for such a gloomy hour. When she saw him, she realized she couldn't let him die. Her courage came from love, but it was insufficient to stop the threat. With ruthless and piercing eyes, Egyptian soldiers swept across the terrain. A newborn's cries could reveal his presence, and even the shadows had ears, so keeping him hidden was a risky endeavor. While fear pressed near her door, the mother held her son close and soothed his cries with lullabies whispered through tears. She did this for 3 months. Her bones ached at every floor creak, door knock, and street whisper. However, babies don't stay motionless, and she knew that eventually she wouldn't be able to conceal him any longer. At that moment, a desperate plan born of grief and faith started to take shape inside of her. Maybe the river itself could hold her son and carry him where her arms couldn't if he couldn't be concealed on land. She prepared a basket of papyrus reeds with trembling hands. Every strip was meticulously woven, as if her soul were being woven into its frame. Her fingers darkened from the work, and she poured tears into the weave as she sealed it with pitch and tar, making it watertight. When it was all said and done, it wasn't a crib of luxury or a cradle of gold, but it was sturdy enough to float and support her hope on the seas. She placed her infant in this little vessel, swathed in cloth, his little face contentedly sleeping. Because this was an act of faith and surrender, the moment was weighty, as if to capture one final memory before leaving him to the current of the river. She put her lips to his forehead and breathed in his aroma. Her heart thumping with fear and faith, she carried the basket to the edge of the Nile, her steps tentative. The river in front of her glistened in the sunlight, as if its depths held both life and death. She stooped to place the basket gently on the water. Cradled by the current, it rocked gently. The child made a slight sound as he stirred, but he remained unconscious. The mother's arms ached from the loss, and her eyes were full of tears as she let go. She saw the basket float away, getting farther out of her grasp with each ripple. She did not, however, completely leave him behind because his sister remained far away, concealed among the reeds, her young eyes silently following the basket's path. The delicate vessel was carried by the current in the direction of the pharaoh's palace, which appeared to be the most dangerous location. Encircled by attendants, the daughters of the pharaoh came to bathe in the verdant gardens that lined the riverbanks. The basket approached there, ensnared in the reeds as if being led by invisible hands. Curious, one of Pharaoh's daughters sent her maid to bring it after noticing it. The child's cry, gentle yet commanding, pierced the air as the lid was raised, revealing light on his face. She felt a sudden surge of compassion since she instantly realized that this was one of the Hebrew children born under the shadow of her father's decree. Her spirit, however, moved with mercy rather than turning away. Her heart melted as she looked at him. Her father's court was hard, but something about the child's helplessness, the tears that clung to his cheeks, and the innocence in his little hands broke through. Despite the danger, she made the decision to save him and raise him as her own. However, a baby cannot survive without a nurse, and it was at this precise moment that the child's sister, who had been observing from a distance, bravely stepped forward. She went up to the daughter of Pharaoh and offered to locate a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. After receiving permission, the sister hurried to collect her mother, the same woman who had placed the basket on the river. In an act of divine benevolence, the mother who had given up her son was now expected to care for him publicly, not in secret, but under the shelter of the Pharaoh's household. She took him back into her arms, holding him with a fresh sense of amazement, because she had lost him to the river and yet regained him. Pharaoh's daughter gave the child the name Moses, stating, "Because I drew him out of the water." The Nile, which had previously been a tool of Pharaoh's brutality, was now the means of salvation. The boy was raised, first in the arms of his real mother, and then in the royal chambers of Egypt. He was dressed in palace clothing rather than rags of bondage, educated among the Egyptians' wisdom, and trained in kingly speech, knowledge, and manners. However, the love sown by his mother's lullabies whispered still, and the blood of Israel flowed deep within him. He was the adopted child of Pharaoh's daughter and the son of a Hebrew slave. He seemed to have been given a bridge by the river that connected two worlds, the oppressor's power and his people's suffering. It would be years before he felt the full force of this dual identity. He was, for the time being, a child spared from death, a secret prophet whose fate was interwoven with the Nile's very currents. Not by accident, but by an invisible hand that guided reeds and waters, evoked compassion in a princess's heart, and gave strength to a mother who dared to let go, his life had been saved. The river that had given birth to so many sons became the cradle of one. And it was from this cradle that the voice thundering against Pharaoh, the leader who would lead his people through parted waters into freedom, would one day rise. With their burdens heavy and their songs muffled by whips, Israel's cries continued to reverberate through the brickyards and fields. But hope was already being shaped behind the scenes. Threads of deliverance were being woven together in a basket of reeds, in a mother's quiet faith, in a sister's watchful eyes, and in an Egyptian princess's heart. The flame of a destiny that would one day burn bright against the darkness of Egypt's cruelty flickered in the developing boy, who was held first by the river and then by a palace. Silent and vast, the desert's sands whispered in the wind, which seemed to hold secrets that were older than time itself. Weary from their journey, the Israelites set up camp at the base of a mountain that towered over the sky like a massive sentinel. Ahead of them, Sinai towered, its summits shrouded in mystery, as if the sky itself stooped to rest on it. There was a weight in the air, not just from dust, but also from expectation. They were about to experience something bigger than their wanderings. The bare, rocky mountain appeared to be alive with an unseen fire, a presence that made people who looked at it feel both fear and desire. Moses had heard the call first, a voice that was quiet but unwavering, and called him up. After guiding the people out of Egypt's chains through waters that could be split at will, he was now supposed to guide them into a covenant, a binding that would influence not just their lives, but also the path of history. However, this covenant was not delivered in dimly lit corners or whispered in secret rooms. It was to be written on stone, in thunder and flame, and on the quivering hearts of a people who had been adrift for a long time. The people got up at the crack of dawn and assembled at the foot of the mountain. Aaron and the elders were close to Moses when he cautioned them against approaching the mountain because it had been sanctified by the presence that had descended upon it. Since touching even the slope where God rested would invite death, a boundary was drawn, and no one dared to go beyond it. The people waited, dressed reverently, and washed themselves. Men stood silent, mothers hushed their children, and there was such a hush that it seemed the wind held its breath. And then it started. A heavy, dense cloud rolled down, shrouding the summit in shadow. What mortal eyes could not see was hidden by a cloud of presence rather than the darkness of night. The deep roar of thunder that rocked the earth beneath their feet was followed by lightning that split the skies, tearing the heavens with jagged veins of fire. Not from human lips, but from the heights themselves, a long, piercing trumpet blast sounded, its call resonating through soul and marrow. The mountain itself shook as if the earth were alive, moaning under the weight of glory, and the people shivered, their hearts racing. Moses was the only one to be called higher. He was a tiny figure against the enormous slope, disappearing into the cloud that engulfed the summit. To those below, he appeared to vanish into the very abyss of heaven. They were terrified because, despite the fact that they had witnessed miracles in Egypt and the sea dividing in front of them, this was different. This was the proximity of holiness itself, and it was overwhelming. It was not a show of strength against their adversaries. They pleaded with Moses to speak to them rather than God because the voice from the cloud shook them from the bottom of their hearts like rolling thunder. Moses stood inside that cloud, and the air itself appeared to be blazing with glory. Although he was unable to see the eternal with human eyes, he could hear the voice, not human voices, but a resonance that permeated every part of him. The words were felt as much as they were heard, inscribed in the heart like fire on wood. The words that would lead a people into life and bind them with cords of faithfulness rather than iron chains were spoken here. The Creator's breath carved the 10 Commandments into living words, not just rules. The voice described rest sanctified in the 7th day, reverence for the name of the one who had rescued them from slavery, and devotion to him. It demanded the sanctity of life, faithfulness in love bonds, integrity in property, honesty in speech, purity of desire, and honor between generations. These were pillars of existence, not just national laws, and they were addressed to a whole populace standing in shivering awe rather than just one individual. As though the mountain bore witness and the stars leaned close to listen, the sound of them reverberated beyond human hearing and into the very marrow of creation. According to the Book of Jubilees, these words were a part of the eternal law that was written in heaven before creation, and they were more than just commands. They weren't abrupt or novel. Rather, they were the revelation of the eternal, which Moses brought to humanity. In that hallowed account, the mountain was transformed from a site of encounter to a mirror of the celestial tablets, the everlasting record that was written in fire and watched over by angels. Moses was given revelation, a glimpse of the timeless order that unites heaven and earth, rather than invention. The stone tablets, written by God's finger rather than a human hand, were in Moses' arms when he descended. As if light itself had carved the words into stone, their surface glowed with markings that could not be carved with a chisel. He was seen by the populace, his face glowing with a brilliance that made them shudder. The reflection of that glory clung to him, and he had been in the cloud, in the presence. Because the brightness was too intense for them to handle, he draped a veil over his face to allow them to get close. However, shadows continued to linger in the people's hearts even after the covenant was made. Their patience wore thin as Moses stayed in the cloud for many days. Their desire for something concrete led them astray, and the mountain's fire appeared too far away and too terrifying. Prior to that fall, however, there was awe-stricken silence, heart-shaking, and a voice thundering from the cloud, binding the words of heaven to a people on earth. The mountain itself was remembered as a place of wonder and fear. The cloud that covered it was a veil that both revealed and concealed, inviting human hearts into covenant, while protecting human eyes from what they could not bear. The weight of eternity was present in every lightning strike, thunderclap, and trumpet roll. Sinai was more than just stone and dust. It was the nexus of glory and frailty, of heaven and earth. The mediator between the two realms was now Moses, the one who was drawn from the water. He had come here because of his journey from the river to the palace, from the desert to the bush, from the chains of Egypt to the summit of Sinai, where the voice of the eternal etched eternity into stone and into souls. They were chosen, their lives bound to the covenant uttered in thunder and cloud, and although the people below shuddered, they were no longer slaves. That voice's echoes lingered motionless, carried by the wind, whispering of a God who cloaked himself in clouds, so that his people would survive to hear him speak. Purity was always about harmony with creation rather than just ritual. According to the Book of Jubilees, the laws of purity existed from the moment Adam first walked in the garden and did not originate with Moses or even Abraham. The sanctity of the seventh day, the order of the seasons, the cycles of the days, and the distinction between what was clean and what was not were all woven into the rhythm of life. Purity was not a random concept. It was the invisible thread that connected human existence to the divine. Angels who served before the eternal we were the first to notice this pattern, which was later transmitted to humanity as part of the covenantal way. Nothing was tainted when Adam opened his eyes in the garden, his breath blending with God's. The animals behaved in accordance with their kind, the ground was pure, and the waters were unspoiled. The clarity of that world dimmed only when disobedience entered, and purity ceased to be something that could be lived easily, and instead became something that needed to be preserved. The laws of distinction between clean and unclean animals, between what can be eaten and what cannot be touched, were already known to Adam and his offspring according to Jubilees. These laws served as reminders to humanity that they were not their own and that the breath they possessed was taken from a holiness greater than themselves. They were not burdens, but rather markers of remembrance. Noah was aware of these laws as well. His first action after the floodwaters receded and the ark rested on Ararat was to sacrifice the clean animals that had been preserved with his family rather than to ensure their survival. He made a distinction between what was pure and what wasn't because this kind of knowledge was whispered long before Sinai. As stewards of a divine order that transcends time, Jubilees claims that the angels themselves taught these commands. A sign that holiness could be reflected in human life even in a broken world, purity was the earthly manifestation of heaven's law. By the time of Moses, these standards of purity had been reiterated with greater clarity and rigor, so that a people set free from slavery could live in both freedom and holiness. The laws established in the wilderness, such as the washing of the body, the separation from blood and death, the careful eating, and the daily rhythms, were reminders rather than innovations. Derived from heavenly tablets that contained the eternal order, they were as old as Eden and as timeless as the stars. Every rule served as a window into something bigger, involving more than just food and flesh. It also involved bringing human life into harmony with divine purpose. Purity was always about the soul's proximity to the eternal, not just about having clean skin or eating a healthy diet. According to Jubilees, angels themselves complied with these rules by abstaining from corruption and acting in the order of holiness. Humanity was also called to walk in this order, reflecting the heavenly rhythm rather than striving for perfection on their own. In addition to preventing deterioration, avoiding contact with death served as a reminder that God owned life. By refusing to eat what was unclean, one was acknowledging that not everything that was offered was fit for human consumption and that there were limits, even when there were plenty. Purifying oneself after being defiled meant keeping in mind that holiness could always be re-entered and that restoration was always possible. Israel's identity as a people destined for heaven was shaped by the laws of purity, which served as a shield to distinguish them from the other nations. From hand-washing to waiting for days, every little thing was a silent act of obedience that matched eternity. These were symbols incorporated into everyday life rather than pointless limitations. The body itself was transformed into a place to be kept pure and a vessel to honor God's presence. The covenant served as a reminder of Eden's first order, which the people recalled by keeping them. However, these directives also contained mercy. Jubilees serves as a reminder that while sin can leave stains, purification can remove them. Through days of waiting and rebirth, time itself could heal, Sacrifices could restore, and water could cleanse. With each act of obedience, these laws lifted people up and brought them back to God, unlike the chains of slavery. A family refraining from eating unclean food, a woman purified after giving birth, a man cleansed from contact with death, all of these were not just following the law. They were remembering Eden, lining up with angels, and echoing eternity. Every aspect of life was impacted by the rhythm of purity. The days themselves were designated as the great Sabbaths of years, feasts of firstfruits, and festivals of weeks. Each carried a unique kind of purity, a transformation from the commonplace into the holy. Israel was instructed to emulate the angels' observances on earth, just as they did in heaven. Therefore, even time was transformed into a vessel of holiness, with days being lifted out of the ordinary course of life and given an eternal glow. These laws encircled the people like garments as they moved with the tabernacle in the desert. Every washing, abstention, and boundary served as a reminder that they were selected to live as a reflection of the invisible kingdom, rather than like the surrounding nations. According to Jubilees, these commands were written on celestial tablets prior to creation, protected by angels, transmitted through patriarchs, and are currently entrusted to Israel as their treasure. Indeed, they were laws of identity, teaching them who they were and whose they were, as well as laws of purity. The elders would instruct their kids that by abstaining from impurity, washing themselves, and taking a seventh-day nap, they were not only obeying orders but also moving in unison with the angels. Purity evolved into a link between heaven and earth, allowing frail humans to partake in the Eternal's holiness. The silent echoes of Eden, the soft reminder of the world as it was at the beginning and as it would one day be restored, could be heard in every act of obedience, no matter how tiny. Therefore, the purity codes were a whisper of eternity rather than a burden of the law. The same message was conveyed by Moses at Sinai and Adam in the garden. Holiness is a gift from God, not something that man created. Keeping them meant entering a rhythm that was older than the stars, a melody that was first sung by angels and is now being offered to humanity. It would bring them into harmony with the Eternal, who lived in fire and cloud, but brought his people closer by means of the gentle, timeless laws of purity. From the beginning of creation, time itself was a river steered by invisible hands rather than a stream left to chance. According to the Book of Jubilees, the holy feasts and festivals were established in the heavens long before humanity breathed its first breath, and were not human inventions based on culture or necessity. They were woven into the very beat of the universe, protected by angels, and written on celestial tablets. The imprint of the Eternal was left on days, weeks, months, and years, each with its own pulse of sacredness that swept up and down the shore like waves. Walking in these feasts meant living in accordance with the beat of heaven, rather than adhering to earthly customs. The first of these sacred cycles was the Sabbath, a day of rest that was sanctified at the time of creation. The Eternal stopped working not because he was tired, but rather to create a pattern of holiness that would be woven into the fabric of time. Adam was asked to observe the Sabbath as the angels did in heaven. Jubilees highlights that this day was designated from the start as a covenant symbol between the Creator and the creation. It was more than just a break from work. It was a journey into the harmony of eternity, where all striving came to an end and the soul rested in remembrance of the one who created everything. The faithful stepped into a rhythm older than the sun and moon themselves, and every seventh day, heaven and earth came together in silent harmony. The origins of the festivals of seasons were equally divine. Long before Israel assembled at Sinai, the heavenly tablets recorded the Feast of Weeks, which is now known as Shavuot. According to Jubilees, even the angels celebrated it in their own world, praising the changing of the seasons and indicating the week's cycles. Noah continued this feast after leaving the ark, presenting the first fruits of the earth's rebirth. It was a celebration of covenant as well as the harvest because, in keeping with it, people recalled the promises made over many generations. In addition to being a grain offering, each sheaf raised to heaven served as evidence that God ruled over time. Long before the night when Israel huddled in their homes, blood on their doorposts, waiting for deliverance, Passover was also written, in order to ensure that his people would never forget the night the angel of death passed over them. The Eternal had ordained it as a yearly rhythm and a reminder of freedom. However, Jubilees suggests that its origins went deeper because the feast's timing matched the cycles of the heavens as recorded in the heavenly records. The lambs offered as sacrifices in Egypt were merely shadows of a divine appointment that angels had known since the beginning of time, and they were reflections of a larger rhythm. Every year, Israel was entering a story that was much older than themselves and that was written in the heavens as they ate unleavened bread and reflected on haste and deliverance. Those eternal tablets also contained the inscriptions of the Feast of Tabernacles, when Israel lived in tents and recalled their wilderness journey. Abraham himself observed Jubilees long before his descendants wandered the desert, according to Jubilees. He constructed booths and celebrated for 7 days, and the joy of angels who also kept this feast in heaven was reflected in his Ashtir. It was about aligning with divine rejoicing, a celebration of God's dwelling with his people, rather than just commemorating a journey. Every branch that was woven into a booth and every lamp that was lit at night served as a reminder that the earth's flimsy shelters were pointing toward an eternal home where God would eventually dwell with people forever. This divine ordering even gave shape to the new moons and the designated times of the year. Nothing was left to chance or human calculation alone because the heavenly tablets meticulously recorded them. Jubilees insists that the people must keep these appointed times carefully, for to drift from them was to drift from the order written in heaven. Time was not neutral, rather it was a sacred area that flowed from the Eternal's throne like a river. Along its banks, every feast served as a stepping stone that led the faithful to covenant renewal and remembrance. Additionally, there was the Festival of Jubilees itself, which marked 50-year cycles of release and restoration with a great rhythm of sevens stacked upon sevens. Slaves were freed, debts were forgiven, and land was given back to its rightful owners during this time. This was also written in heaven, serving as a reminder that time was merciful and that the passage of time was not a never-ending toil, but rather a path toward healing. Jubilees tells us that the angels joyfully maintained this rhythm, and Israel was called to emulate it, making sure that freedom and justice flowed as smoothly as the seasons. Every feast was an opportunity to participate rather than just remember. Not only were the days being marked, but a cosmic harmony was being entered when families came together to eat unleavened bread, when fields were harvested and first fruits were lifted, and when lamps burned during the Festival of Booths. The feasts served as windows through Wasostukos. Hitch the mundane gave way to the eternal, where heaven and earth met. As if every celebration brought them back into the garden's lost harmony, children learned these rhythms at their parents' knees, not as a simple custom, but as a holy legacy. Jubilees cautions against ignoring these divine appointments. To lose the rhythm of holiness etched in time itself, to forget them was to move out of harmony with heaven. Without these feasts, the nations roamed around according to their own schedules, but Israel was obligated to a higher order. By observing the festivals, they developed into a people influenced by covenant and the invisible forces of heaven rather than just harvests. In a world that changed like sand, every celebration served as an anchor, keeping them firmly rooted in their God. The people could look up and know that their feasts were reflected in the heavens as the desert nights stretched across Israel and the stars wheeled silently overhead. The appointed times were also marked by the same stars that whispered Abraham's innumerable descendants. They were preserved in eternity by angels, and they were reflected in history by humans. As a result, Divine time moved in a circle of remembrance, renewal, and celebration rather than in a straight line, uniting generations. Instead of being chains, the feasts recorded in the heavens were songs, songs of freedom, covenant, harvest, and home. They served as a reminder to humanity that there was always divine presence present in every season and that time was never empty. To walk in them was to join angels who stood guard over the eternal throne, to enter a melody sung before creation. Time itself hinted at a bigger story, one that was not limited by the earth, but rather recorded in the heavens for all eternity, in every feast and holy day. When the world appeared to be covered in a layer of peace during the night, another world erupted in battle that was invisible to the naked eye. The Book of Jubilees and ancient customs describe a conflict in which power currents flowed through the invisible world like winds rather than swords clashing or shields shattering. On one side stood angels, luminous and unflinching, defenders of truth and light. The fallen spirits, restless and troubled by the memory of rebellion, were on the opposite side, shadows roving the earth in an attempt to disturb what had been made good. Men's and women's souls, as delicate as flickering lamps, were trapped between whispers rising from the dark and voices calling from the light. The deceased were the remains of a long-gone sorrow, those who disobeyed the Eternal's command and left their position in the harmony of heaven existed long before human history extended. Despite being cast down, they remained as restless spirits that were neither willing nor able to return. Like storm winds, they swept through the corners of creation, causing confusion, fostering jealousy, and calling for cruelty. According to the Book of Jubilees, their influence permeated subsequent generations, luring people to act violently and rebelliously. Despite the death of the great giants that resulted from their union with mortals, their spirits persisted, moving about like restless shadows. The obedient angels, sent by the Eternal to watch over and lead humanity, stood against them. These were not far-off entities, but guardians who moved in silence next to men's offspring, invisible allies who traveled through both cities and deserts. Like the rising sun, their strength was steady rather than loud. They turned the eyes of the faithful upward when despair pressed down, reminded the weary of promises, and whispered courage to trembling hearts. These two hosts were engaged in a never-ending struggle for the guidance of every soul, not a conflict between armies on dusty battlefields, because people walked like those who were caught between two winds. They experienced the sting of envy, the rush of rage, and the call of desires that left them empty one moment, followed by the gentle pull of compassion, the desire to forgive, and the longing to pray. These storms weren't sporadic. Rather, they were the reverberations of that unseen battle. Jubilees depict spirits that are destined to deceive, each one tugging at the strands of human frailty. They lingered during frightening moments, whispered in dreams, and pushed when temptation reached out. However, angels were also there, supporting, lifting, and reminding the soul of its actual purpose. When one imagines the scene, it almost seems dreamlike. The earth sleeping beneath the stars, the villages quiet, but above and surrounding them, a battlefield devoid of trumpets and banners. While shadows slithered out of mortal sight, angels moved through the darkness like flames. Humans occasionally felt the imminence of this conflict during the restless wakings of sleep, the burden on the chest, the unexpected calm following prayer, the inexplicable solace during difficult times. At these times, the silent war brushed the boundaries of conscious existence, and the invisible closed in. Even after their rebellion was put down, the fallen spirits continued to crave power. They aimed to twist what was intended to be good, to tear apart men's souls one by one, rather than to topple the heavens once more. According to Jubilees, they preyed on children, dragging them toward deception and sowing the seeds of corruption at a young age. In turn, the angels prayed for humanity, presenting the Eternal with requests that the spirits be subdued, their strength reduced, and their hold relaxed. It was a slow battle over the years of each life, where decisions and allegiances weighed more than iron, and it was fought not by equals, but by perseverance. No human could survive this conflict unaffected. Its pressure was felt even by the great patriarchs. Jacob battled not just his brother, but also invisible forces. Isaac carried the burden of silence, and Abraham was aware of the temptations of fear. Betrayed and sold, Joseph might have given in to resentment, but his angelic strength saw him through the darkness of the prison. Moses was facing not just a monarch, but also the heartless spirits behind a throne when he stood in front of Pharaoh. Every life was a place where the invisible war touched the earth, according to their tales, which were dispersed throughout the Bible like stars. Even in this conflict, there was tenderness. The Eternal did not leave his creation to the whispers of the spirits, even though they sought destruction. He gave them wisdom through his law, purity codes to keep them rooted against corruption, and feasts to remind people of his time. Every commandment served as a light against the approaching darkness rather than a burden. Angels were chosen to guard and teach, moving covertly among the populace. In a valley where shadows were pressing in, the faithful who remembered, fasted, and prayed were like torches held high. Their obedience became a weapon of light, and their very faithfulness became a resistance in the invisible war. But the fallen's whispers were crafty. They disguised lust as love, rage as strength, and envy as ambition. They instilled in rulers the belief that one life was more important than another, and inspired them to establish empires on the backs of the weak. Small betrayals, harsh words, selfish acts, and wars and cruelty on earth were all reflections of their whispers. However, light moved in the same way that shadows did. One word of truth turned into a barrier against dishonesty, and one act of forgiveness became a flame that drove darkness back. There was always hope despite the never-ending struggle. The angels did not sleep when one lay down to sleep, not realizing the struggle going on around them. As souls drifted into dreams, they protected them like silent sentinels. In those dreams, one might occasionally see voices calling softly, ladders reaching upward, or battles populated by strange figures. These were echoes of the impending war, rather than just mental ramblings. Some saw these visions as frightening, while others saw them as peaceful as still waters. Both served as reminders that life was never lived in solitude, but rather in the whirlpool of invisible forces. The Eternal's mercy was greater, according to the Book of Jubilees, even though humanity was caught between these forces. The fallen spirits could whisper, but not break the bond of a soul that clung to God. They could entice, but not coerce. Even though they couldn't be seen, the angels were always close to people who looked up into heaven. They stood like unseen but unflinching pillars in the silence, the darkness, and the long nights of adversity. Age after age, night after night, the fight continued, a battle of unseen forces circling the delicate yet resilient hearts of men and women rather than one of flesh and blood. There has always been a presence throughout humanity's convoluted history that is too silent to be noticed, but too powerful to be ignored. Angels are described as gentle companions who are sent not only as messengers, but also as watchers, guides, and guardians of the delicate human lives of those radiant beings who move between the worlds of heaven and earth. According to the Book of Jubilees, they are intricately interwoven with the very fabric of creation, closely involved in both men's and women's struggles, watching over, guarding, and whispering during quiet times. Their function is not always made evident by ostentatious displays of authority. More often than not, it is concealed in the subtle twists and turns of everyday existence. The unexpected calm in a terrifying moment. The silent bravery to move forward when hopelessness weighs heavily. The feeling of companionship when no one else is around. Angels sang invisible songs of joy when children were born, and they hovered near grieving households like unseen hands offering consolation. They did not appear with the violence of thunder, but they were more powerful than storms. Rather, they arrived like a silent wind, blowing through fields at dusk, invisible to most but evident to the soul it touched. Jubilees implies that in addition to messages from the Eternal, they also brought instructions and guidance to assist humanity in adhering to the laws of purity, celebrating holy feasts, and remembering long-ago promises. It was a friendship rather than a remote lesson, as if each life had a companion who would never leave their charge. Even though many people were unaware of their proximity, the effects of angelic care were felt for generations to come. Angels accompanied Abraham on his journey through uncharted territory, guiding him and allaying his family's anxieties. It was more than just a dream of ladders and light when Jacob, exhausted and running from his brother, laid his head on stone. It was a glimpse of the ever-present proximity of these messengers, who were climbing and descending, bringing blessings and prayers from earth to heaven. The whisper of a guardian who would not let him be forgotten was the strength that kept Joseph from giving up when he was wallowing in the shadows of the prison, not his own efforts. Angels were never supposed to take away human freedom. Rather, they were supposed to gently lead, remind when the way became unclear, and console when the heart faltered. Their eyes lingered with strength and tenderness, like vigilant parents who never slept. They carried requests to the throne of heaven when human voices erupted in prayer. They soothed restless spirits when fear gripped them, and they whispered reminders of the law when temptation arose. Sometimes they appeared in radiant form, as when they visited Abraham beneath the oaks or led Lot's family out of the burning city, and other times they shielded without being seen, like invisible walls preventing harm. However, their presence remained constant despite their concealment. Because these watchers' gazes were carried within every soul, no matter how powerful or forgotten. In addition to shepherds in fields and children in cradles, kings sat on thrones with angels nearby. Because every life was valuable in the Eternal's design, guardianship was granted to everyone, not just the powerful. Their solace was particularly close during quiet moments, when prayers seemed to go unanswered, and during long, exhausting nights. Even though there was no voice from above during these times, angels' soft hands were close by, protecting, bolstering, and encircling. According to some legends, when death drew near, angels would bend down to lead souls through the passage that no mortal had ever charted. Many thought that angels carried the spirit gently, like parents carrying a child into new light during those silent last moments when eyes closed to the earth. Their compassion demonstrated that no soul was left to fend for itself in the dark, reflecting the kindness of heaven. In this sense, they served as guardians in this life as well as escorts into eternity, always present and dependable. The angels also functioned as teachers, imparting divine knowledge with quiet perseverance rather than thunder. They were there, clothed in fire and cloud, when the laws were written on Sinai. They served as a reminder to the populace that these laws were gifts of light, not burdens, and were intended to protect them from corruption. According to Jubilees, they are defenders of the festivals enshrined in the very order of creation and guardians of sacred time. Through their whisper, humanity learned to honor days that mirrored the pattern of eternity and to mark the seasons not according to their own will, but according to heaven's design. Angels became the unseen strength when hearts faltered and hope faded. Think of Elijah, exhausted under the broom tree, when his despair was so great that he wished for his death. An angel touched him, gave him water and bread, and gave him the strength to go on. The pattern recurred throughout lives. When loneliness weighed too heavily and fear threatened to overcome, the soft hands of angels reached through the quiet with protection, provision, and hints of bravery. Their movements were quiet yet steady, strong yet gentle, with a dreamlike beauty. Their comfort was provided regardless of recognition, so they were not constrained by the cacophony of human recognition. There were moments when their presence was briefly seen in unexpected deliverance, a threat barely escaped, or an unexplained peace. In other cases, it was only known after the fact, when one looked back and saw that invisible assistants had been there at every turn. They were protectors who never asked for gratitude, but never left their posts, companions that no one invited, but who were carried by all. Men's children never traveled alone as they traversed cities, deserts, battlegrounds, and dark nights. Every secret tear and every silent prayer were witnessed by the angels. They reverently presented those prayers to the throne, carrying them up like treasures. The cries of the weakest were thus never forgotten or ignored. Through the gentle ministry of these beings, the Eternal woven his care into the fabric of creation, ensuring that no day was without unseen companionship, and no heart was without comfort. Angels were still more present, even though fallen spirits also moved, stirring shadows and whispering confusion. Their whispers carried truth into the storm of lies, and their silent hands steadied the trembling. Despite the intense conflict between light and darkness, humanity was never left helpless. Angels served as peacekeepers, guardians of hearts, and counselors for souls, in addition to being fighters in the invisible war. Whether remembered or forgotten, accepted or disregarded, their proximity was as constant as breath. Men and women live alongside creatures whose hands never tire and whose watch never fails in every generation. Their presence lingers like a gentle light in the stillness of the night, when fears are at their most pressing, like the consolation of an invisible yet felt hand. Their murmurs endure in children's laughter, in the tenacity of the tired, in the unexpected calm that comes like dew. The unseen tale of life is shaped by the tender hands of angels who lead humanity through its hardships and lead it gradually toward the everlasting light that lies beyond the curtain. Human hearts have been bound to the Eternal One by the thread of promise that has subtly woven itself through generations since the beginning of time. This covenant in the Book of Jubilees is not just a verbal agreement made with one man and then forgotten over time, nor is it just a moment in time. Instead, it is characterized as a living stream that shines and flows unbroken through every age and family since the beginning of creation. The covenant, which is eternal and protected by heaven itself, was not created by human volition, but rather is woven into the very fabric of existence. The world's history seems to be told in an uninterrupted chain, with each link interconnected and extending beyond memory into eternity. Even though Adam's steps faltered and his hand reached for something that was forbidden when he first entered the garden, the echo of a covenant that predated his disobedience still echoed within him. He carried the promise of restoration with him as he left the gates of paradise, but the Eternal's concern for him never ended. The covenant's initial rumor was that despite human error and future generations' forgetfulness, heaven's faithfulness would endure. Jubilees emphasized that the laws, feasts, and sacred ways were not later inventions, but rather existed from the beginning of creation. It is as if the covenant had always been there, unshaken and eternal, waiting to be remembered by every generation that came after it. Noah became another bearer of that unbroken chain as he stood encircled by the remains of a world that had been swept away. The rainbow in the sky was a promise to him and all future generations that the Eternal would never again abandon the planet to complete destruction. His covenant was a visible connection between heaven and earth that extended across the horizon and was as broad as the heavens. Jubilees portrays this moment as a continuation of the promise that was first whispered in Eden, a reminder that humanity was never left behind, even when judgment weighed heavily. The covenant endured hardship and storm like a bridge of light. The chain shone brighter from Noah to Abraham. After being called out from the land of idols and embarking on a journey without maps, Abraham became God's friend, and the covenant gained new significance. His offspring would number as many as the stars, and his descendants as many as the sand grains. This promise is given a lot of weight in the Book of Jubilees, which reminds readers that it was intended for his seed to be passed down through the generations, an unbreakable legacy of blessing and faith. The covenant with Abraham was eternal, carried by angels, protected by heaven and rooted in creation itself. Unlike the flimsy agreements of kings that wane with the passage of time, there was more to the chain of covenant. Jacob wrestled with it through sleepless nights. Isaac carried its weight in obedience and silence, and his offspring carried it into places of slavery and starvation. The promise held true even in Egypt, where their cries rose like incense. The covenant gleamed in heaven's memory, despite their backs being bent under the weight of Pharaoh's labor and their voices being muffled by taskmaster's lash. It could not be drowned in tears or erased by chains. The Eternal remembered, and Jubilees serves as a reminder that remembering was an active rather than passive act of mercy that would soon result in deliverance. The next person to carry this unbroken link was Moses, who was called from the wilderness by fire that did not consume. At Sinai, the covenant was rekindled, like a flame rekindled on an altar that had been neglected for a long time, rather than being presented as something new. The laws inscribed in stone were timeless truths that were once again visible to humanity. They were not recent inventions. Jubilees highlights that these instructions were known by the angels before the world was created and are now given to Israel so they can live in accordance with the plan of heaven. The covenant served as a reminder of what was always intended to be, and a call to live in the light of an unending promise rather than as a burden placed on tired shoulders. The covenant is pictured as an unbroken chain, which conveys a sense of beauty and weight. It is given to each generation as a duty to be carried, polished, and passed on, rather than as a decorative item to be appreciated and put aside. In addition to teaching their children words, mothers and fathers also instilled in them the rhythm of holy time, feasts and Sabbaths, remembering deliverance and hope for fulfillment. In this sense, the covenant existed in homes, at tables, in fields, and beneath tents rather than being limited to priests and prophets. It was a legacy woven into everyday existence, an imperceptible yet unbreakable thread connecting one age and one heart. The chain remained intact even when the people stumbled, when their hands reached for idols and their hearts strayed after other gods. Even though it was concealed by the dust of disobedience, it was still there, waiting to be picked up by hands again. In every era, prophets emerged to call the people back to their ancient covenant rather than to something new. Their words revealed the mercy of the Eternal, reminding Israel that heaven had remained faithful despite their lack of loyalty. As steadfast as the stars above them, the chain stood as a testament to unforgotten promise. The covenant spanned time as well as generations. Although Israel carried it as a chosen vessel, it was not limited to any one country. The promise was intended to be fulfilled through them, bringing all peoples together to embrace the plan of heaven. By situating the covenant within creation itself, woven into the cycle of festivals, the order of days, and the purity of life, Jubilees reflects this universal vision. It was a rhythm etched into the world's heartbeat, waiting to be recognized by every soul yearning for light rather than a gift given in a single location. From a distance, the unbroken chain gleams with a beauty that is almost surreal. Imagine the long line of humanity, with each generation interconnected and every life impacted by the glimmer of unending promise. Abraham carrying it across strange lands, Noah lifting it after the flood, Moses holding it in trembling hands beneath the clouded mountain, and Adam giving it to Seth. Imagine the children of Israel gathered together in both the promised land and the wilderness, clinging to it through prayers, feasts, and firelight storytelling, gleaming constantly with the certainty that heaven had not abandoned it. The chain continues past kings and shepherds, through exile and return. The core of Jubilees' covenant vision is this: timeless, unwavering, and unbroken. Although humanity may falter and generations may come and go, the chain endures because it is rooted in the Eternal's strength rather than human frailty. Like threads of light, it ties everything together, tying the beginning to the end, enduring storms, and bringing hope through silence. The covenant is a living memory rather than merely history. It is a promise that is renewed with each act of obedience performed out of love, every prayer raised, and every breath of faith. As it always has and always will, it shines in silence, waiting for hands to grasp it, for hearts to believe in it, and for it to continue shining into yet another generation. Some historical tales fade not because they are shallow or unlovely, but rather because the world becomes too preoccupied or afraid to preserve them. Among these tales is the Book of Jubilees, a holy book that once weighed the voices of angels and the patterns of heaven, but gradually faded into obscurity as its pages faded from most people's memories. Jubilees faded slowly, like parchment left in dust and darkness, rather than abruptly, like a candle extinguished in the night. Its words were once reverently read, carefully copied, and preserved as a part of the vast corpus of sacred knowledge. However, as the centuries went by, its position in the canon became ambiguous, and its voice became less distinct from the more boisterous echoes of other texts. The mystery of memory itself, how societies choose what to preserve and what to let fade into silent forgetfulness, lies at the core of this fading. Jubilees provided explanations, extensions, and a divine order beneath the surface of history, in addition to recountings of historical events. It maintained that rather than being the result of later times, the laws and feasts were timeless and etched into creation itself. Some people found this vision's claims to be too audacious, too binding, and too heavenly. Jubilees were gradually pushed to the periphery of discussions about what should be included in the sacred canon. Although it was adored in its day, its influence waned as a result of the councils and voices that eventually influenced the official scripture collections. What was once considered valuable turned into suspect, and suspicion has a way of stifling even the most eloquent speech. However, books rarely completely disappear, much like seeds. They might wait in silence even after being discarded, preserved in obscure places, and kept alive by those who continue to find sustenance in their pages. Instead of disappearing from the world, Jubilees persisted in sporadic occurrences, hushed rumors, and devoted customs that resisted its demise. This was especially true in Ethiopia, where the text was devotedly preserved long after it had vanished from most libraries around the world. As a component of their greater canon of scripture, the Ethiopian tradition regarded Jubilees as sacred, rather than as an odd or prohibited work. Ethiopia remembered while other places forgot, and as a result, the book did not end in complete silence. It is eerie to think of the centuries when the book was kept secret from the majority of people, only known to a select few monks, copied by hand, protected in stone-carved monasteries, and read aloud while lamps flickered against ragged walls. A memory that might have been lost was preserved by these voices. Its pages' worn edges, the meticulous ink strokes, and the reverence of the hands that turned the parchment that bore witness to tales of angels, covenants, and cosmic order are all nearly visible. Like an ember glowing under ash, what appeared forgotten in the vast world continued to breathe in Ethiopia's mountains and valleys, awaiting the day it might be discovered once more. Jubilees' decline begs the question of how sacred memory is formed. Why do some texts become well-known and endure for centuries in innumerable translations and editions, while others are forgotten and remain obscure? Was it a question of power, doctrine, or just the precariousness of human preservation? The exclusion must have felt like the silencing of a respected elder to those who loved Jubilees, even though the councils that discussed canon may have had their own theological or pragmatic justifications. For a while, its stories, which were so rich in cosmic detail and vivid, remained alive in memory. But as the generations passed and new voices influenced the religious landscape, it gradually became quieter. But the spirit of the book persisted even as it faded. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, buried in caves close to Qumran and preserved in jars after centuries of silence, fragments of Jubilees emerged. These pieces attested to the book's previous popularity outside of Ethiopia, where devotional communities had read and copied it, finding in its words a sense of divine order that upheld their faith. Every shard is like a whisper on the desert wind, a reminder that holy words frequently manage to survive even when most people have forgotten them. Not everything that disappears from human libraries also disappears from the earth. The silent disappearance of Jubilees has a poetic quality. Jubilees disappeared virtually unnoticed, vanishing from the lips of readers and the hands of scribes, in contrast to other texts that were violently banned or destroyed by fire. It vanished quietly, like a song that was no longer sung, its melodies only recalled by those who dared not forget. However, its survival also has a certain charm because, despite being mostly forgotten, it was never completely lost. The enduring power of words intended to convey light is demonstrated by its existence in Ethiopia, its resonance in Qumran, and its rediscovery by scholars in subsequent centuries. The waning of memories in people's lives is reflected in the waning of Jubilees. How many stories do grandparents tell at funerals only to disappear when no one remembers to tell them again? How many songs are sung just once before being cut off? However, just as some memories resurface in dreams or are discovered in old letters, Jubilees also made a comeback in the public consciousness. There was a long pause before its voice returned, but its fading was not the end. Rather, it was a pause in the rhythm of its telling. It felt like the lifting of a veil and the opening of a forgotten chest when the modern world rediscovered Jubilees through Ethiopian manuscripts. The book that many had believed to be lost suddenly reappeared, rich and intact, its stories still glimmering, its vision still spanning time. Jubilees' survival served as a reminder that obscurity does not equate to irrelevance and that silence does not always imply death. Since what is rooted in eternity cannot be completely erased by the shifting winds of history, the silent disappearance of sacred words may only be temporary. A profound sense of wonder is left behind by the tale of Jubilees' fading and survival. The peculiar, tenacious nature of sacred memory is demonstrated by the fact that a book could vanish from the majority of the world while continuing to exist in the obscure interior of Ethiopia. It implies that there is always more preserved than we are aware of, and that hidden gems await discovery beneath the surface of history. Perhaps Jubilees' decline was a form of concealment, a means of protecting the book until the world was ready to hear its voice once more, rather than a loss. And now, when its words are read again, the tale of its disappearance becomes a part of its beauty, a purse out of silence that heightens the impact of its return. When the final words of a lengthy tale are uttered, the night becomes quiet, and the heart feels as if all the burdens of history have been gently placed on the ground to rest. The voices of bygone eras seem to whisper in this silence, not loudly or urgently, but softly, as if they are aware of our weariness and desire for silence. Their voices are hushed rather than lost, serving as a reminder that every story, no matter how big or obscure, becomes a soft lullaby when it is told right before bed. It serves as a reminder that even though a lot has been forgotten, nothing is really lost. The giants and angels, the covenants and the hidden books all fold into a single breath of peace. Right now, the forgotten time feels more like a loving embrace, keeping us steadfast through the night's dark hours than it does like silence. It's easy to imagine that the heavens themselves, which are located beyond our world, move in a quiet rhythm akin to a peaceful person's breathing. The patient light of the stars holds the secrets of tales that are far beyond human recollection. Even when we feel alone, they serve as vigilant guardians, reminding us that the world is never truly empty. Their glow is comforting rather than demanding, as if to convey the message that sleep is sacred and that closing one's eyes is a sign of faith in the one who watches over everything. The final murmurs of time are not ominous, rather, they are calls to let go of the day and let the spirit float on the peaceful current that permeates the universe. The memory of those who came before, who prayed, dreamed, and hoped under the same moon that shines tonight, is carried in every word of these tales. This serene quiet is infused with the ancient voices of prophets and scribes, the sounds of desert wanderers, and the songs of exiles by rivers. Their voices now join the silence of eternity, despite their fierce struggles and restless hearts. They speak of rest, of consolation, of the soft reality that love has never stopped flowing through time, rather than of struggles and burdens. Every sharp edge and loud echo fades in these final murmurs, until only the music of silence is left. The angels who have passed through these stories might be close by tonight. They are close like a gentle breeze sweeping across the face, but not overpowering or noisy. They reassure weary hearts that peace is achievable even in a restless world by speaking in consolation rather than commands. They touch the edges of our anxieties with their invisible hands, pulling them away to make room for peaceful dreams. Like the warmth of a candle after it has been extinguished, the memory of their tender touch lingers, glowing inwardly and imperceptibly, but profoundly. These murmurs also contain a prayer that requires few words. It rises gradually, like the first rays of dawn, without hurry or force, just in the moment. For the heart, the house, and the exhausted body resting after a long day, it is a prayer for peace. It requests rest that revitalizes, healing sleep, and peacefully consoling dreams. For those who are listening, it is a prayer that, in this moment, you will feel secure enough to let go of your burdens and allow them to rest on the shoulders of heaven. And as the prayer progresses, it appears to be less like words and more like a soundless song, a melody that drifts through the quiet and calms the soul. All of them now take a step back, their voices quiet, their stories folded away like books on a shelf, the giants and fallen spirits, the prophets and laws, the forgotten texts and eternal covenants. They are now at rest after being recounted and remembered. The comfort of knowing they existed, that their stories had significance, and that by hearing them, we are a part of the continuous chain of memory are what endure rather than the acerbic nature of their disputes. Their final mutterings serve as a reminder that stories never truly end. They always stay in the heart, waiting to be resurrected when the night demands it. The soul is thus invited into silence as these murmurs diminish. Picture yourself lying beneath a sky so vast that each star appears to be a lantern that has been lit for you. Imagine the steady rhythm of your own breathing blending with the rhythm of creation itself, or the gentle hush of wind blowing through old trees. Nothing demands or presses in this silence. The only advice is to take a nap, close your eyes, and have faith that the world will keep turning under the watchful eyes of hands bigger than our own. As sleep draws near, the forgotten time becomes a background melody that uplifts the soul rather than something lost. Thus, let this tale conclude with a sigh of relief rather than a loud cry. Let it conclude with the prayer you feel gripped by tonight, encased in serenity as if by invisible wings. I hope you have a light heart, gentle dreams, and restful sleep. May the angels who have passed through these pages stay close by and protect you as the night deepens. I hope you wake up feeling rejuvenated and aware that the most healing voice is still found in silence, even in a noisy world. Allow your presence to linger with us if this journey has calmed your evening and if these whispers have led you closer to rest. In order to keep these stories flowing and create more evenings of wonder and serenity, please like, share, and subscribe. Share your thoughts and leave a comment to help expand this circle of rest and remembrance. When you're ready to embark on a new adventure, allow your heart and eyes to find the next tale that is waiting for you, always close by, always ready, always whispering you toward tranquility. Now close your eyes. Allow the forgotten time to melt away into slumber. Peace endures even though the story is over. Take a deep nap and allow the whispers to carry you.